Long before cities, before kings, before gold meant power, the story begins in silence, high in the Anatolian highlands, where ancient hands first noticed that some stones were different. They were not impressive at first glance. Scattered among familiar gray flint and black obsidian, these stones carried a dull green stain, as if the earth itself had breathed color into them. Hunters and toolmakers, already skilled at shaping stone with sharp, confident blows, picked them up out of curiosity more than intention. And in that quiet moment, without ceremony, human history tilted in a new direction. When struck, these green-tinged stones did not behave like stone at all. They did not shatter into sharp flakes. They bent. They bruised. They changed shape beneath the force of a hammerstone, as if the material itself was alive and willing to be persuaded rather than broken. To people who understood the language of stone fractures by instinct, this was shocking. It was wrong in the best possible way. First, there was no grand plan. No one imagined a future of metal weapons, wealth, or cities. They hammered simply to see what would happen. And what happened was possibility. Copper flattened. It spread. It could be coaxed into beads, pins, small cutting edges. It could be shaped again and again without falling apart. Each blow taught a lesson. Each mistake became knowledge passed from hand to hand. By around 5500 BC, this quiet experimentation had become something recognizable. Across Anatolia and the Balkans, the earliest copper objects began appearing in the archaeological record. At places like Keonu in southeastern Turkey, small copper beads and tools tell a story of patience and observation. These objects were not cast or melted. They were born entirely from cold hammering, shaped slowly by repeated strikes, guided by eyes that learned to read the metal's resistance. The craftsman soon noticed another secret. After too many blows, copper hardened and cracked. But when left near fire, when warmed and allowed to cool, it softened again. No one knew the word annealing, but they understood the effect. Fire was no longer just for warmth or cooking. It had become a teacher. These discoveries did not happen in isolation. The people experimenting with copper lived in communities already undergoing deep transformation. One of the most revealing places was Catalhouk, a dense settlement occupied for more than 1,000 years. From above, it looked less like a village and more like a single organism. Mud brick houses pressed tightly together, entered through openings in the roof rather than doors at ground level. Inside those homes, life was changing. Families were no longer doing the same work. Some shaped obsidian, some wove textiles, and in certain houses, copper objects began to appear. The walls were painted with scenes of animals and symbols. Bull heads with real horns were embedded into plaster. Beneath the floors, the dead were buried with care, surrounded by increasingly complex grave goods. This was no longer a world of simple equality. The presence of copper working tools in specific households tells a quiet but powerful story. Knowledge was becoming concentrated. Not everyone knew how to shape metal. Not everyone had access to the raw material. Certain families, certain lineages controlled both the skill and the supply. And with that control came influence. Then the climate shifted. Around 5200 BC, temperatures dropped across much of Europe and Western Asia. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests became less predictable. This was the 5.2 kilo year event, and it pressed communities hard. When food is uncertain, efficiency becomes survival. Tools that lasted longer mattered. Tools that worked better mattered. Copper answered that pressure. Copper awls pierced leather more cleanly than bone. Copper knives stayed sharp longer when cutting tough plant fibers. And when damaged, they could be reshaped instead of discarded. In a world under stress, malleability was power. As demand grew, local surface finds were no longer enough. Communities began to look outward. Trade networks stretched farther than ever before. By 5000 BC, organized mining was already underway. At Bunur in Bulgaria, deep shafts cut into the earth, some more than 10 meters down. This was not casual gathering. This was planned labor. Teams worked together, supported by communities that believed the effort was worth it. Copper began to move. And as it moved, Society changed. Trade required trust. Trust required systems. Standardized weights began to appear, small polished stones shaped to consistent sizes. Copper objects themselves became currency, carrying regional styles that revealed where they were made and who made them. Exchange was no longer occasional. It was regular, expected, structured. And somewhere along the Black Sea coast, around 4600 BC, the consequences of all this concentration of metal, knowledge, and trade became impossible to ignore. At Varna, a cemetery appeared that rewrote what power looked like. One grave in particular, later called Grave 43, held the remains of a man buried with nearly 1,000 gold objects. Over a kilogram of gold. Copper tools with gold hafts. Ornaments meant not to work, but to dazzle. This was something entirely new. Metal was no longer just useful. It was symbolic. It was status made visible. Some graves held everything. Others held nothing. And some held riches without bodies at all. Symbolic graves honoring power itself. Metallurgy had crossed a line. It was now shaping hierarchy, memory, and identity. And the story was only accelerating. What began as curiosity in the hills was no longer small or quiet. By the middle of the 5th millennium BC, copper was everywhere, not just in tools, but in the structure of society itself. Population numbers were rising across southeastern Europe and Anatolia. Villages swelling into dense communities where thousands of people depended on one another to survive. And with every new mouth to feed, the demand for tools, for efficiency, for coordination grew sharper. Copper production intensified. Archaeological sites from Romania to Bulgaria show growing piles of slag, broken molds, and discarded fragments, the waste of increasingly organized workshops. This was no longer experimental craftsmanship. It was production. Larger furnaces appeared. Specialized spaces were set aside for metalworking. Fire, once a household companion, became an industrial force. As communities grew, they needed systems. Resources had to be allocated. Labor had to be organized. Disputes had to be resolved. And again, control over metal became one of the fastest ways to authority. Those who controlled copper controlled farming efficiency, craft production, and warfare. At sites like Karanovo and Harsova, houses clustered around central courtyards where communal activities took place. Metalworking was no longer hidden inside private homes. It moved closer to the heart of the settlement, visible, supervised, and socially charged. The placement of workshops was a message. Metallurgy mattered, and those who managed it mattered even more. But copper did not exist alone. Its rise pulled other crafts upward with it. The high temperatures needed to smelt metal transformed pottery production. Kilns grew hotter. Ceramics grew stronger, thinner, more standardized. Pottery styles spread across regions, their patterns acting like fingerprints that allow archaeologists to track connections across hundreds of kilometers. Regional identities emerged. In the Balkans, casting techniques became increasingly refined. In Anatolia, surface decoration and intricate finishing flourished. Communities did not all do the same thing. They specialized, and specialization meant dependency. No settlement could produce everything it needed. Trade networks stretched farther and farther. Copper from the Carpathian Mountains moved south and west. Obsidian from Aegean Island continued flowing north. Coastal routes linked inland communities to maritime traders. Exchange was no longer about survival alone. It was about advantage. With advantage came competition. Copper weapons began to appear in greater numbers. Axes, spear points, and maces were not dramatically sharper than stone, but they endured. A broken obsidian blade was useless. A bent copper weapon could be reforged. Over time, that difference mattered. Armories could be maintained. Power could be preserved. Fortified settlements appeared on hills and ridges. Walls thickened. Ditches deepened. At places like Plotnik and later sites across the Balkans, evidence of violent destruction emerged alongside weapon damage. Metallurgy had entered conflict, and yet something even larger was unfolding. Between 4500 and 4000 BC, parts of southeastern Europe witnessed an experiment never before attempted. Settlements expanded beyond anything seen in prehistoric Europe. The Cucutini Tripilia culture built communities that were not villages, not towns, but something closer to cities. Vast, planned, astonishing in scale, in central Ukraine at Taljanki, a settlement spread across more than 300 hectares. Thousands of houses arranged in concentric rings around a massive central plaza. An estimated 15,000 people lived there at its peak. No kings, no writing, no stone monuments, and yet coordination on a breathtaking scale. Each ring had its own purpose. Some zones focused on pottery, others on textiles, others on metallurgy. Houses were large, multi-room structures, built with timber frames and clay walls, 2 stories high. Ground floors worked, upper floors lived. Many homes had their own kilns, turning pottery production into a household industry rather than a rare specialization. The pottery itself was extraordinary. Spirals and geometric patterns in black and red danced across cream-colored surfaces. Achieving this required multiple firings and precise temperature control. This was not casual craft. This was mastery, and it was everywhere. Millions of pottery fragments now litter these sites, the debris of industrial-scale production. Clay was hauled from sources tens of kilometers away. Fuel was gathered relentlessly. Entire logistical systems existed just to keep the kilns burning, and still, metal flowed. Copper tools, ornaments, and weapons circulated through these mega settlements, linking households into networks of exchange and obligation. Metallurgy had become woven into daily life. And yet, beneath the order, stress was building. Large populations demanded stability. Fields had to yield consistently. Trade routes had to remain open. Peace had to be maintained. And history had taught nothing about how to manage societies of this size for long. The experiment was fragile, because while these massive communities flourished in the north, something very different was happening far to the south, in the river plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. And what emerged there would change the trajectory of human civilization forever. For a time, it worked. The great settlements of the Cucutini Tripilia world pulsed with life. Smoke rising from thousands of kilns, fields stretching outward in every direction, copper tools moving from hand to hand. But size brings vulnerability, and complexity demands balance. By around 4200 BC, the balance began to fail. Across the region, signs of strain appeared almost simultaneously. Houses were burned, not chaotically, but deliberately. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ash and then abandoned, never rebuilt. At site after site, archaeologists found the same pattern. Carefully constructed homes, filled with possessions, destroyed in controlled fires and left behind. These are not accidents. They were endings. Why this happened is still debated. Some argue ritual, a symbolic closing of a household's life cycle. Others see fear, scorched earth responses to approaching enemies. But climate tells its own story. Around this time, the world entered the 4.2 kilo-year event. Temperatures dropped. Rainfall became unreliable. Fields that once fed thousands began to fail. Mega settlements that depended on surplus could not survive sustained shortages. Trade networks frayed. Social trust weakened. Fortifications multiplied. And then, quietly but decisively, the experiment ended. Populations dispersed. The vast concentric cities were abandoned. Europe's first attempt at urban-scale living collapsed, and nothing like it would return for nearly 2,000 years. While this was happening, far to the south, the opposite story was unfolding in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. Along the shifting channels of the Tigris and Euphrates, small farming communities were doing something different. They were not growing fast. They were growing steadily. This was the Ubaid period, beginning around 5500 BC, and its power lay in patience. Urdu, one of the earliest settlements. Archaeologists uncovered 18 successive building phases stacked atop one another like pages in a book. Each generation built over the last. No sudden explosions, no abrupt abandonment, just continuity. Reed huts became mud brick houses. Houses clustered into neighborhoods. Neighborhoods gathered around temples. The secret was water. Mesopotamian communities learned to tame the rivers. They dug canals that stretched for kilometers, channeling floodwaters into fields, storing moisture for dry seasons, draining excess salt from the soil. These are not small ditches. They were engineered systems with gates, basins, and maintenance schedules, and they required organization. No single family could manage irrigation alone. Water demanded cooperation, rules, authority. Temples became the center of this new order. Religious leadership and practical management fused into a single institution. The gods, it was believed, demanded order, and order fed people. Within this framework, metallurgy transformed. Copper workshops appeared near temple complexes, not hidden, not private. Metalworking became sacred work. Craftsmen operated under institutional supervision, producing tools, vessels, and ornaments according to standardized methods. Furnaces multiplied. Molds became more complex. And for the first time, copper was intentionally alloyed. Arsenic and tin were added, creating harder, more durable metals. The earliest bronze-like materials were born. These tools outperformed pure copper. They held edges longer. They struck harder. They lasted. Metallurgy in Mesopotamia had crossed another threshold. Workshops like those at Tel Sawan reveal production on a scale unseen elsewhere. Multiple furnaces, designated areas for smelting, casting, finishing, quality control before distribution. This was not craft. This was industry, and demand kept growing. Copper objects filled temples, not just as tools, but as offerings, symbols, architectural elements. Religious art emerged in metal, culminating in objects like the famous lion-headed eagle relief, a declaration that metal could carry myth, authority, and memory. But Mesopotamia had no metal of its own. The alluvial plains held fertile soil, but no copper. Every ingot had to come from somewhere else. Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains, the Arabian Peninsula. Trade was no longer optional. It was existential. And so long-distance exchange expanded again, this time under institutional control. Temple authorities guaranteed weights, purity, fairness. Standardized measures spread. Clay tokens tracked quantities. Cylinder seals marked ownership. Administration was being invented in real time. That as trade intensified, competition followed. Strategic settlements fortified themselves. At Tel Sawan, massive defensive walls rose, complete with towers and gates controlling river access. Warfare was no longer occasional. It was organized. Copper weapons appeared in destruction layers, bent, broken, used. Settlements shifted on a higher ground. Buildings clustered tightly for defense. Entire temple complexes were enclosed within walls, creating fortified cities capable of surviving sieges. Religion, economy, war, and technology fused into a single system, and it worked. While Europe's mega-settlements vanished, Mesopotamian communities endured. They adapted, they recorded, they planned. The foundations of true cities were forming, not through explosive growth, but through controlled complexity. BY 3500 BC. The stage was set. Writing was on the horizon. Cities like Uruk were expanding rapidly. Copper, water, and administration had reshaped what society could be. And the ripples did not stop at the rivers, because as Mesopotamia grew, the land between Europe and Asia, Anatolia, found itself standing at the center of a new world economy. As Mesopotamian cities tightened their grip on trade and administration, Anatolia's role changed forever. No longer just a landscape of villages and hills, it became the bridge between worlds. Copper flowed through it. Ideas moved with it. And along its coasts and straits, power began to concentrate in places that could see the sea. Nowhere was this clearer than at Troy. Perched on a limestone ridge overlooking the narrow throat of the Dardanelles, Troy was perfectly placed. Every ship moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to pass beneath its walls. By around 3500 BC, the settlement was no longer modest. Stone fortifications rose, Massive blocks carefully fitted together, weighing tons, demanding coordination, leadership, and wealth. Inside the walls, life looked different from the past. Houses were larger, multi-roomed, built on stone foundations with timber-framed upper stories. Hearths were engineered to vent smoke efficiently. Storage rooms were designed for bulk goods. These were homes built for accumulation, not just survival, and copper was everywhere. Workshops at Troy produced axes with complex hafting systems, pins adorned with decorative heads, vessels shaped with an understanding of how molten metal flowed and cooled. Chemical analysis shows that the copper came from multiple regions, the Taurus Mountains, the Pontic Ranges, perhaps even farther. Troy was not a producer alone. It was a distributor. Maritime trade made this possible. Wooden ships, 15 to 20 meters long, shallow enough for rivers but strong enough for open water, became the engines of long-distance exchange. Sailors learned to read the sky, the winds, the coastlines. Navigation became a skill passed down through generations. Along the shores, signal fires and landmarks guided ships through dangerous passages, turning the sea into a connected highway. Harbors transformed coastal settlements. Stone quays, breakwaters, mooring posts appeared. Warehouses filled with standardized containers designed for transport. Trade was no longer improvised. It was planned. Prosperity followed the routes. Across western and southern Anatolia, settlements rose to exploit these connections. At places like Baser Hoyuk and other inland hubs, copper objects were produced specifically for export. Pottery forms standardized, matching the capacities needed for trade. Everything pointed towards systems thinking. But trade does not exist without control in eastern Anatolia. At Arslantepe, something unprecedented appeared. Monumental architecture. A massive complex covering over 1,000 square meters, decorated with wall paintings, reliefs, and carefully planned spaces. This was not a temple alone. It was administration made visible. Inside, clay seal impressions recorded transactions. Storage rooms held standardized vessels. Workshops produced metal tools in uniform shapes and sizes. This was bureaucracy in its earliest form. Authority no longer lived only in tradition or religion. It lived in systems. Copper production at Arslantepe reached new levels. Furnaces processed ores from multiple sources at once. Alloys were tailored for specific uses. Molds produced identical weapons and tools. Metal was no longer just crafted. It was managed, and management created hierarchy. Elite burials from this period tell the story clearly. Graves filled with copper weapons, ornaments, imported materials. Objects meant to signal dominance in life and remembrance in death. At sites like Alika Hoyuk, royal tombs displayed wealth beyond function. Weapons gleamed with precious metal inlays. Standards and ceremonial objects spoke of authority performed in public. These weapons were not symbolic alone. Many show signs of use. Blades chipped, shafts repaired. Conflict was real as Anatolian polities grew. They competed for routes, mines, ports. Destruction layers appear across the region. Settlements burned, rebuilt stronger, then burned again. At Kultepe and Kanesh, trade never fully stopped, even amid warfare. Commerce was too valuable to abandon. Out of conflict came diplomacy, alliances formed. Shared technology spread. Similar pottery styles and metalworking techniques appear simultaneously across distant sites, evidence of cooperation as much as competition. Anatolia became a web of connected powers, balancing trade, war, and negotiation. And copper was at the center of it all. Anatolian metal objects reached the Aegean Islands. Mesopotamian cylinder seals appeared in Anatolian cities. Europe, the Near East, and the Mediterranean were now tied together by exchange networks that had never existed before. What began as green-stained stones and quiet highlands had become the backbone of international trade, political authority, warfare, and urban life. And the world would never return to what it had been. By the late 4th millennium BC. The transformation was no longer subtle. Across Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, Copper had stopped being an experiment, stopped being a novelty, and stopped being just a material. It had become infrastructure. The systems built around it were now stronger than any single ruler, settlement, or generation. In Mesopotamia, cities like Uruk expanded beyond anything the world had ever seen. Neighborhoods spread outward from monumental temple complexes. Streets followed planned routes. Drainage systems controlled floodwater. Storage facilities held vast surpluses of grain. And at the center of it all stood institutions that could command labor, track production, and enforce rules. Metal workshops operated with precision. Raw copper arrived in standardized ingots. Smelters adjusted alloy ratios deliberately. Casting molds produced uniform tools, weapons, and ritual objects. Quality mattered. Consistency mattered. These were the early mechanics of a managed economy. Administration followed close behind. Clay tokens multiplied. Cylinder seals became personal signatures of authority. Goods were marked, counted, redistributed. While writing had not yet fully emerged, its logic already governed daily life. Obligation, debt, ownership, and labor were being recorded in material form. This changed how people understood power. Authority was no longer only personal or ancestral. It was procedural. It lived in storage rooms, seals, weights, and ledgers of clay. Whoever controlled the flow of metal, food, and labor controlled the city. And metal, once again, shaped conflict. Weapons became more standardized, more numerous. Spears, axes, maces, and daggers appeared in arsenals rather than households. Warfare shifted from sporadic violence to organized campaigns. Fortifications grew taller. Gates grew narrower. Watchtowers rose along rivers and roads. The same systems that enabled trade enabled war. Across Anatolia, political entities hardened into early states. Leaders no longer ruled only through kinship or charisma. They ruled through control of production. Workshops fed armies. Storage fed workers. Administration fed legitimacy. Copper and early bronze became symbols of command. A ruler with metal weapons could project force. A ruler with metal tools could build faster. A ruler with metal prestige goods could command loyalty. Yet even as power solidified, the networks expanded. Trade routes stretched farther than ever before. Copper from Anatolia reached deep into the Aegean. Tin, still rare and mysterious, began to appear from distant sources. Gold and silver circulated alongside utilitarian metals, reinforcing social hierarchies. Maritime trade intensified. Harbors grew busier, ships larger, cargoes heavier. Coastal settlements prospered while inland hubs controlled redistribution. The sea became a political space contested and controlled. And slowly, almost without announcement, copper gave way to something stronger. Alloys improved. Bronze emerged as the dominant material for weapons and tools. Harder, more reliable, deadlier. The transition was not sudden. Copper lingered, but the direction was irreversible. By this point, the old world of small, flexible communities was gone. The systems built during the Copper Age had locked society into new patterns. Hierarchy was normal. Specialization was permanent. Long-distance trade was essential. Warfare was institutionalized. Administration was unavoidable. Humanity had crossed a threshold. The Bronze Age did not arrive with a single invention or a single city. It arrived because thousands of decisions, experiments, and adaptations had accumulated into a world that could no longer function without metal at its core. From quiet greenstones in the hills to cities ruled by seals and blades, the story of copper was never really about metal. It was about how humans learned to organize themselves around power. And once learned, that lesson could never be unlearned. Why now? The world ran on metal, but the cost of that dependence was beginning to surface. The systems that copper and bronze had built were powerful, efficient, and unforgiving. Once societies depended on long trade routes, centralized authority, and specialized labor, failure in one place could ripple outward with devastating force. Mines dug deeper. Forests vanished into furnaces. Fields were pushed harder to feed growing populations who no longer farmed for themselves. Cities demanded constant input: food, fuel, or labor. Stability was no longer natural. It had to be enforced in Anatolia and the Near East. Rulers rose who understood this reality. Control of copper sources meant leverage. Control of roads and ports meant survival. Fortifications multiplied not just against enemies, but against uncertainty. Every wall, every gate, every seal impressed in a clay reflected a quiet fear of collapse. Social divisions widened. Craftsmen became specialists for life. Farmers worked land they did not own. Elites accumulated metal they would never use. Prestige objects grew larger, heavier, more elaborate, as if excess itself could prove legitimacy. Gold-covered weapons that would never strike. Ceremonial axes too thin to cut. Power had become performance, and still conflict intensified. Weapons standardized further. Training became formalized. Armies emerged as permanent institutions rather than temporary gatherings. Warfare stopped being seasonal and became strategic. Settlements were no longer destroyed by chance. They were targeted. Yet people did not abandon these systems because they could not. Too many lives depended on them. Too much knowledge was locked inside workshops and institutions. Too much coordination was required to go backward. The memory of earlier worlds faded. The age of flexible villages, of shared skills and portable lives, became unreachable. Children were born into hierarchies they did not choose. Identity became tied to profession, status, and allegiance. The Metal Age reshaped not just tools, but the human mind. And through all of it, copper remained present, even as bronze rose beside it. Old techniques coexisted with new ones. Cold hammer traditions survived next to casting furnaces. The past was never fully erased. It was absorbed by the time true Bronze Age civilizations dominated the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. The foundations were already ancient. Writing would soon appear. Laws would be carved. Empires would rise and fall. But all of it rested on decisions made long before kings had names. Decisions made by people who noticed green-stained stones. People who learned that the earth could be reshaped. People who discovered that control over materials could become control over others. The Copper Age was not a stepping stone. It was the turning point. The moment when technology stopped serving only survival and began to structure society itself. From that moment on, history moved forward faster, heavier, and harder to stop. And even now, thousands of years later, the world still runs on a logic first forged in those early fires. Metal changed what humans could do. But more importantly, it changed what humans became to be. Why this point? No one living in that world remembered how fragile it all once was. Copper or bronze trade routes, cities, temples, walls. These were no longer innovations. They were assumptions. Life was built on them so completely that imagining a different way to exist had become almost impossible. Children grew up watching metal poured into molds, not wondering how it worked, but simply accepting that this was how tools were made. Farmers no longer shaped their own blades. Warriors no longer forged their own weapons. Skills that had once belonged to everyone were now locked inside workshops, guarded by tradition, secrecy, and authority. Knowledge had become power in its purest form. In Mesopotamia, temple institutions expanded their reach. Grain stores filled and emptied according to schedules decided by administrators, not seasons alone. Labor was assigned. Rations were measured. Copper tools were distributed to those deemed worthy or useful. The system rewarded obedience and efficiency and punished deviation quietly. Without spectacle, in Anatolia and the Aegean, merchant elites rose alongside warrior leaders. Control of ships, harbors, and warehouses became just as important as control of land. A man who owned no fields could still become powerful if he controlled movement of goods, of metal, of information. The sea itself became political. Ports were fortified. Shipbuilding knowledge was protected. Routes were negotiated, defended, and sometimes fought over. What had once been open water became territory without walls. Copper ingots moved like blood through veins, sustaining distant communities that would collapse without them. And still, inequality deepened. Burials tell the story clearly. Some graves overflowed with metal, gold, imported luxuries. Others held nothing but bones and soil. Status followed families now. Power hardened into inheritance. The gap between ruler and labor widened with each generation. Yet, these societies endured. They endured because the systems worked. Most of the time, they produced food. They organized defense. They created meaning through ritual and order. People accepted hierarchy because hierarchy delivered stability, and stability was precious in a world still shaped by climate, disease, and uncertainty. But endurance carried a hidden cost. The more complex society became, the more catastrophic failure could be. A broken trade route meant famine. A lost mine meant weakened armies. A failed harvest meant unrest. Collapse no longer came slowly. It came suddenly. And this knowledge lived quietly in the background of every decision. Rulers built walls not just against enemies, but against fear. Temples stored surplus not just for generosity, but for control. Weapons were displayed not just for defense, but as reminders that be why the end of this long transformation, humanity stood in a new position. People no longer simply adapted to the world. They engineered it, redirected rivers, drained marshes, dug mountains open, crossed seas by design, and there was no return. Even when civilizations fell, the knowledge did not vanish. It scattered, it migrated, it resurfaced elsewhere, reshaped but familiar. Copper working, trade systems, administration, hierarchy, these ideas outlived every city that birthed them. They became the inheritance of the future. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, empires, kingdoms, all followed paths first cleared during this long, quiet revolution. The Copper Age was the rehearsal, the testing ground, the moment humanity learned both how powerful it could become and how dangerous that power was. And still, the story is not finished, because the same forces that shaped those ancient worlds, technology, control of resources, inequality, trade, fear, ambition, are the forces that continue to shape ours. Before copper ruled systems, it ruled attention. Long before anyone understood smelting, alloying, or trade routes, copper stood apart for one simple reason: it did not behave like stone. You could strike it, and instead of shattering, it bent. You could hit it again, and it bent further. Strike it enough, and it hardened. Heat it, and it softened again. Early humans, this was unsettling. Stone obeyed rules. Bone obeyed rules. Wood obeyed rules. Copper did not. It remembered what you did to it. It changed because of you. The first people to encounter native copper didn't see a metal resource. They saw something alive in a way no other material was. Nuggets pulled from riverbeds gleamed red-orange in the sun, unlike gold's cold shine or silver's pale glow. Copper looked warm, almost fleshy, and it appeared where people already lived. Copper did not hide deep underground at first. In places like Anatolia, the Balkans, the Levant, and the Caucasus, native copper surfaced naturally. Erosion exposed veins. Rivers carried fragments downstream. You could find copper without digging, without mining, without even knowing what mining was at IT. First, it wasn't tools that mattered at IT, was ornaments, beads, rings, small hammered sheets wrapped around wood or bone. Copper objects show up in graves thousands of years before true metallurgy, not as weapons, but as signals. Something rare, something different, something that marked a person. This is important. Copper entered human society through meaning, not efficiency. Only later did people realize it could cut, that a copper edge was not better than stone at first. It dulled quickly. It bent, but could be reshaped, repaired, reclaimed. A stone blade broke and was gone. Copper could be reborn. This changed how people thought about objects. For the first time, tools had lifespans. Histories. A blade could belong to a grandfather, be reforged for a son, reshaped for a grandson. Material continuity entered human culture. And then came fire. Some point, No one knows exactly when someone placed copper-bearing stone into a hearth hot enough to change it. Not intentionally at first. No grand insight. Just accident. Just heat and curiosity. What emerged shocked them. Metal flowed. Not like water, but not like stone. It softened, glowed, separated itself from rock. It revealed itself. This was a new category of matter, one that responded to human control in a way nothing else had. From that moment on, copper was no longer just found at IT was made. Early smelting was crude. Open fires, shallow pits, inconsistent temperatures. But even these imperfect methods worked often enough to matter. Slag piles began to form. Green-stained stones were collected deliberately now. Sites near or sources became special places. Knowledge clustered. People who knew how to coax metal from stone became valuable. Then essential. Then powerful. Metallurgy was not obvious. It had to be taught, watched, remembered. It did not spread evenly. It spread socially. And here's the quiet truth most histories rush past. For centuries, maybe millennia, copper was not about superiority. IT coexisted with stone. Stone blades stayed sharper. Stone tools stayed cheaper. Copper survived because it did something stone could not. It connected human intention directly to material transformation. You could shape copper while thinking. This feedback loop mattered more than sharpness. It trained minds to imagine materials as systems that could be controlled, optimized, improved. Copper was the first material that taught humans how to engineer, and once that mental shift occurred, there was no turning back, because copper wasn't just a substance anymore, that IT was a promise. Copper does not yield all at once. That's why it trained humans instead of overwhelming them. When early metallurgists heated copper-bearing stone, they didn't get clean metal every time. Most attempts failed. The fire was too cool, the air wrong, the stone unchanged. And then, suddenly, one attempt worked. A bead of glowing red metal pooling at the bottom of the hearth. That inconsistency mattered. IT forced observation. People noticed patterns long before they understood reasons. Some stones worked. Others didn't. Charcoal burned hotter than wood. Covered fires behaved differently than open flames. Air mattered. Position mattered. Time mattered. Copper demanded processed at a physical level. Copper is unusually cooperative. It melts at a temperature reachable with charcoal fires, around 1085 degrees Celsius. High, but not unreachable. More importantly, copper oxides release metal when heated in low oxygen environments. You don't need complex chemistry. You just need the right conditions, repeated often enough. Early furnaces were not inventions. They were evolutions. Shallow pits deepened. Clay linings thickened. Open fires gained partial walls. Someone added a stone slab as a windbreak. Someone else covered the fire with broken pottery shards. Someone realized blowing into the fire made it hotter, then invented bellows without knowing they'd done so. Every improvement was incremental. None required theory, and copper rewarded every improvement visibly. Too cold, nothing happens. Hot enough, the stone sweats metal. Hotter still, the metal flows. This immediate feedback loop was new in human experience. Stone napping gave results, but not transformation. Cooking transformed food, but not matter itself. Copper changed category in front of your eyes. IT taught causality. Even hammering copper taught lessons. Strike it gently, it spreads. Strike it hard, it stiffens. Strike it too much, it cracks. Heat it again, and it forgives you. This cycle, work, harden, soften, repeat, is annealing, though no one had a word for it. But they understood it intuitively. This mattered because it rewired how humans thought about labor. Effort alone wasn't enough. Timing mattered. Sequence mattered. Knowledge mattered more than strength. Copper separated doing from understanding, and that separation created specialists. Not everyone could smelt. Not everyone could cast. Those who could became focal points of attention. People brought them stones, fuel, food, offerings. Metallurgists became nodes where resources gathered. Workshops formed not because of command, but because of gravity. And with workshops came secrecy. Smelting knowledge was fragile. If everyone knew it, it lost value. If no one knew it, it vanished. So it was taught selectively, through apprenticeship, through watching, not explaining, through ritualized behavior that preserved technique without exposing reasoning. This is why early metallurgy feels mystical. Not because people were foolish, but because the knowledge worked better when encoded in ritual. Do this. Say this. Heat it this long. Don't ask why. Just do it right. Copper was the first technology that encouraged this structure, and slowly, copper taught humans something else. Materials could be optimized. Different ores behaved differently. Some flowed better. Some produced harder metal. Some left brittle results. People sorted stones, blended them, rejected some, valued others. This was proto-science in equations. No theories, just controlled variation and memory. By the time alloying appeared, humans were already trained. Adding arsenic or tin didn't feel like magic. It felt like another step in a familiar process. Change the inputs, change the outcome. Copper had prepared them, and that preparation mattered more than the metal itself. Because once humans learned to think this way, in steps, variables, feedback, they could apply it everywhere. To agriculture, to construction, to administration, to power. Copper was not just the first metal. It was the first teacher. If you walk through the earliest copperworking sites, you don't find elegance. You find mess, broken furnace walls, misshapen lumps of half-melted metal, slag crusted with trapped copper droplets, charcoal ash mixed with green-stained rubble. To modern eyes, it looks like incompetence. To archaeology, it looks like learning in progress. Slag is the key. Slag is what happens when rock and metal argue and don't fully separate. It's heavy, ugly, glassy, and useless, except that it tells a story. Every slag pile is a record of heat reached, oxygen present, or composition in human decision-making. Early smelters didn't know they were producing slag. They just knew that sometimes metal appeared, and sometimes it didn't. So they kept the leftovers. This is crucial. They didn't throw slag away immediately because it still contained copper. That meant two things. First, they understood the process was incomplete. Second, they believed it could be improved. People resmelted slag, crushed it, heated it again, changed fuel, changed airflow. Every failure became an experiment, even if they didn't call it that. This is how furnaces evolved. Open hearts lost too much heat, so walls grew taller. Clay linings thickened to hold temperature. Tuyères, clay pipes, appeared to direct air into the fire. Bellows turned breath into pressure. Pressure turned fire into control. Suddenly, smelters weren't just making fires. They were engineering environments, and copper responded dramatically. Cleaner separation, larger metal pools, less trapped slag. Yield increased. Effort paid off visibly. Casting followed naturally. To T first. Molten copper was poured into simple depressions in stone or sand. The results were crude, blobs, rods, uneven plates. But once again, copper taught through feedback. Smooth cavities produced smoother results. Covered molds cooled slower. Two-piece molds allowed complex shapes. Mistakes piled up here too. Molds cracked. Metal leaked. Objects warped. But broken casts weren't wasted. Copper could be melted again. Failure didn't mean loss. It meant delay. That reusability changed human behavior. It reduced fear of experimentation. Stone mistakes were permanent. Copper mistakes were temporary. This encouraged trying new shapes, new thicknesses, new functions, and slowly, intentionally or not, people began designing tools for specific jobs. Axes thickened at the blade. Awls narrowed to points. Chisels gained reinforced spines. No one announced these improvements. They emerged from repeated failure and adjustment. At the same time, people noticed something strange. Some copper was better. Certain smelts produced metal that was harder, less prone to bending. At first, this seemed random. In truth, it wasn't. Arsenic-rich ores were doing the work. But from the human perspective, it was a mystery with patterns. Those patterns mattered. Stones from certain hills were preferred. Smelting sites clustered near them. Trade routes bent toward them. Metallurgists guarded their sources. This is where copper stops being local. Once people realized not all copper was equal, movement became necessary. Or had to travel. Knowledge had to travel. Specialists had to move or be protected. And so metallurgy pulled humans into wider worlds. Slag heaps grew. Furnace fields spread. Entire hillsides were stripped for fuel. You can still see it in pollen records. Forests retreating, charcoal increasing, human fire reshaping landscapes. All of this came from failure, not success. From piles of useless waste that taught humans how to do better next time. Copper didn't reward brilliance, it rewarded patience. Once humans mastered the basics of surface copper, curiosity pushed them deeper. Native nuggets were finite. The rivers ran out. Hillsides gave up their scattered veins. The first miners realized that to keep producing copper, they had to reach into the rock itself. But mining was not simple. The earliest shafts weren't grand tunnels. There were holes in the ground, sometimes narrow enough that a person had to squeeze in sideways. Sometimes just pits scraped by stone tools. The walls were unstable. Darkness was complete. Fires were lit to see and to drive out moisture. Smoke filled lungs. Every breath was a risk. Every step could collapse the fragile walls. And yet, people persisted. Tia Banner in Bulgaria, some shafts reached over 10 meters deep. That doesn't sound like much today, but consider every strike of a stone hammer in a hard rock, every haul of, or to the surface, every ember to keep the fire going. It was back-breaking labor. Coordination became necessary. People didn't mine alone. Teams formed, tasks divided. Someone struck, someone cleared rubble, someone carried ore, and someone kept watch over the air, the fire, the walls, the people. The work itself shaped society. Miners' bodies changed. Arms grew thick with muscle. Hands toughened. Lungs adapted to smoke. Eyes adjusted to dim light. And minds changed too. A communal rhythm emerged, based on necessity, observation, and trust. Lives became interdependent. Copper demanded it, and copper rewarded it. The deeper shafts yielded richer veins, larger nuggets, more consistent ores. Every successful extraction meant new tools, new ornaments, new social leverage. Families with mining knowledge gained prestige. Communities near or deposits gained power. Trade routes widened to move metal from the mountains to settlements. And suddenly the local world became international. But the first miners also learned humility. Every collapse, every misfire, every loss of life reminded them that the earth was not a passive resource. Copper had to be coaxed. It had to be negotiated with patience, skill, and observation. Rituals arose, offerings before digging, songs while striking, observances for safe passage into shafts. Metallurgy became not only technical, but sacred. Because beneath the earth, copper wasn't just a material. It was a mediator between human effort and natural law. And as people descended into the rock, the culture above changed too. Families invested in miners. Communities built workshops to process or immediately. Storage pits were dug to keep raw materials safe. Knowledge became strategic. Secrets became currency. Copper reshaped social hierarchy before anyone called it power. From these early mines, a pattern emerged that would echo for millennia. Wherever copper was found, humans would follow into labor, into complexity, into society itself. Once copper was mined, it had to be transformed. At first, this happened on hearths in simple homes, small pits with open fires. But as demand grew, people began to cluster production into dedicated spaces, the first workshops. These spaces were chaotic and alive. Charcoal fires glowed constantly. Smoke spiraled through low ceilings. Tools, stone hammers, anvil-like stones, wooden tongs lay everywhere. Piles of copper, ore, and crushed slag littered the floor. Fragments of half-formed beads, pins, and axes glimmered like embers in the dim light. Here, copper began to teach humans intention. Cold hammering was the first step. Nuggets were flattened with stone hammers, shaped into thin sheets, beads, or pins. Repeated striking hardened the metal, but it was slow, limited, imperfect. Copper resisted, then surrendered, then hardened again. Craftsmen learned patience, rhythm, and precision. Each strike mattered. Each error could crack the piece. And then came fire at T first. Heat was applied experimentally. Placing a copper sheet near embers softened it slightly, making hammering easier. Repeated attempts revealed something extraordinary. Fire changed the metal predictably. Heat too low, nothing happened. Heat just right, copper became pliable. Heat too long, it melted away. From this, the first annealing cycles emerged. Heat, hammer, repeat. Craftsmen didn't know metallurgy as we define it today, but they understood processes intimately. They learned to read copper's response like a language. Every change in color, every sound of the hammer, every bend taught them how to manipulate it. Workshops became schools of observation. Some families or lineages specialized. They guarded techniques. Apprentices watched silently for years, learning rhythm, timing, and temperature. Knowledge was encoded in gestures, in steps, in rituals. Fire wasn't just heat. It was a teacher, a partner, a challenge, and the results were transformative. Copper objects moved beyond the practical. Beads, pins, bracelets, small, decorative, intricate, carried meaning. A person wearing a copper ornament signaled skill, wealth, or connection. Tools like knives and chisels became durable and reparable. And slowly, society adapted. Wealth and status were now measurable not only by land or food, but by metal objects. But workshops also shaped the world. They were often positioned near settlements, but kept separate from homes because fire was dangerous. Smoke, sparks, and noise meant that metallurgy reshaped living spaces. Communities adapted layouts, storage for ore, spaces for fuel, areas for shaping and cooling metal. And copper kept teaching that IT responded differently to each hammer strike, each furnace, each type of ore. Craftsmen learned experimentation, observation, and adaptation. Failure wasn't shameful, it was data. Each broken pin, each warped blade, each misshapen bead fed collective knowledge. Copper transformed human cognition, preparing minds for more complex tasks, trade, administration, urban planning. This was the real power of the first workshops. They were more than production sites. They were learning engines. Humans learned to see systems, processes, and cause and effect relationships on a scale no other material had taught them. Copper was no longer just a resource. It was the foundation of craft, economy, and social order. Once people had mastered shaping copper, its value extended beyond utility. It became a medium of exchange, a marker of prestige, a tool of influence. Communities that controlled sources of or had skilled metallurgists suddenly held power. And because copper was portable, visible, and durable, it could move across villages, hills, and valleys, spreading influence and connecting distant people. Trade emerged almost naturally to a settlement with copper, but no grain traded with a farming village. One community with specialized ornaments exchanged them for tools or livestock. Over time, these exchanges became regular, organized, and eventually measured. Standardized weights and markers appear in the archaeological record, suggesting that people were accounting for value, not just giving gifts. And with trade came differentiation. Not every family could produce copper. Not every village sat near or wealth began to accumulate. Graves began to reflect this. Some individuals were buried with dozens of copper objects, carefully shaped and polished, while others had simple pottery or none at all. This was the first visible stratification in human society tied directly to a material resource. Copper also catalyzed long-distance connections. Archaeologists have found evidence that ores from Bulgaria, Anatolia, and the Balkans traveled hundreds of kilometers to settlements that had no local copper. Objects bore distinctive regional styles, showing that knowledge and aesthetics were being exchanged along with the metal itself. Copper became a bridge, linking cultures, facilitating communication, and spreading technology faster than anyone could have imagined. But trade brought challenges too. Communities had to protect routes, secure mines, and manage relationships. Conflict emerges in the record. Fortified settlements, weapons in graves, and signs of violent destruction suggest that copper's value made it worth fighting for. Control over metal wasn't just economic, it was political. People learned that power could be material as well as social. The wealth copper created also encouraged innovation. Larger workshops, more sophisticated furnaces, alloy experiments, all appeared in regions tied to trade networks. Communities invested in improving output because copper now had multiple roles: practical, decorative, symbolic, and strategic. Every increase in technical skill could enhance prestige, economic leverage, and influence. And so the first hierarchies arose. Some families or lineages monopolized access to smelting knowledge or to finished goods. Metallurgists became respected authorities. Wealthy families displayed their power through copper and eventually gold, signaling their elevated position within the community. Social stratification, once subtle, now had a tangible, visible medium. Metal. Copper transformed not only what humans could make, but how humans organized themselves. From workshops to trade, from burial customs to defensive walls, copper reshaped settlements, networks, and society itself. It became the backbone of early social complexity, a foundation upon which early civilizations would build. By the late Copper Age, metallurgists were no longer simply hammering nuggets into shape. They were experimenting with heat, molds, and mixtures, pushing the boundaries of what copper could do. The first true casting appeared. Molten metal poured into stone or clay molds to produce axes, knives, and ornaments. This wasn't random. Craftsmen observed flow, cooling, and contraction. They learned to prepare molds so that metal would fill every crevice, producing a finished object with precision. And then came the revelation. Copper could be made stronger. Some ores contained arsenic. Others contained tin. By combining copper with these elements, sometimes by accident, sometimes by deliberate mixing, metal became harder, more durable, and more versatile. This was the birth of alloying. It allowed tools to hold sharper edges, weapons to withstand repeated strikes, and objects to resist wear. This technological leap had social consequences. Not everyone could alloy successfully. Knowledge became secret, guarded by master craftsmen. Those who understood the chemistry of metal gained influence. Their workshops became centers of training, experimentation, and production. And the objects they produced weren't just functional, they were symbols. A finely cast axe, a delicate pin, a polished dagger. These items conveyed skill, status, and access to knowledge. Casting also changed production scale. Hammering a nugget is slow and limited. Casting allows replication. Workshops could produce multiple tools, ornaments, or ceremonial objects at once. Standardized shapes appear in the record. Axes with identical blades, pins with uniform lengths. Repetition demanded planning, organization, and oversight. Early management born from metallurgy, and copper's influence extended beyond itself. Furnaces designed for higher temperatures also allowed experimentation with pottery. Kilns improved. Ceramics became stronger and more decorative. Communities producing copper and ceramics created cultural signatures that spread across regions. Copper wasn't isolated technology. It reshaped multiple crafts simultaneously at the same time. The jump toward bronze loomed. Once arsenic and tin were deliberately added to copper, the first bronze appeared. Harder than pure copper, bronze promised longer-lasting tools and weapons. This transition marked the next step in human ingenuity, understanding that materials could be engineered, shaped, and combined to achieve specific purposes. Metallurgy had become a science in practice. Even before chemistry existed as a concept, communities that controlled knowledge of alloying gained dominance. Trade networks expanded to access tin from distant regions. Wealth and influence became linked not only to possession of metal, but to mastery of production. Copper had created the framework. Bronze would intensify it. And all of this began with a nugget in a hill, a fire, and a human willing to strike, observe, and learn. Copper had become more than a metal. It was a teacher, a connector, a driver of social and technological evolution. It shaped communities, economies, and eventually civilizations. That'd be why the Mid-Copper Age. Copper was no longer just a tool or a trade commodity. It had become a marker of identity and hierarchy. Graves tell the story. Some contained nothing but simple pottery, while others held dozens of carefully crafted copper objects, axes, pins, beads, sometimes accompanied by gold, shells, or exotic stones. The distribution of metal in burials reveals the first clear signs of social stratification. Wealth and status were literally embedded in material form. Elite graves weren't just for the dead. They broadcast messages to the living that a burial richly adorned with copper announced the power of the family, the lineage, the community. It displayed who controlled resources, who commanded labor, and who understood the secrets of metallurgy. Copper became a symbol of authority and legitimacy, and societies began to organize themselves around access to metal. Ritual practices intertwined with copper as well. Offerings were made of hammered copper and finely cast objects. Temples and communal spaces contained metal artifacts not for use, but for veneration. Craftsmen often worked under religious or ceremonial supervision, linking metallurgy to sacred knowledge. The fire of the workshop mirrored the fire of the hearth, both literal and symbolic, bridging the earthly and spiritual worlds. And these elite objects were not just decorative. They were political tools that a well-placed gift of copper could secure alliances between communities. A ceremonial axe or pin could signal loyalty, marriage, or pact. Metallurgy became a language of diplomacy, and those who mastered it wielded influence that extended far beyond their settlements. Communities without access to copper adapted in response. Some sought trade partnerships. Others attempted raids or fortifications. Sites with rich deposits became contested spaces, giving rise to early forms of organized conflict. Copper, while beautiful and practical, had made societies both cooperative and competitive. It incentivized innovation, social organization, and the management of labor on an unprecedented scale. And yet, copper also democratized knowledge slowly. Craft knowledge began to spread as apprentices trained under masters. Techniques were observed, copied, and adapted across regions. Different communities developed their own distinctive styles, Balkan casting methods, Anatolian decorative motifs, but shared the underlying principles of metallurgy. Copper became a medium of cultural identity as well as economic and social power. In essence, by this period, copper had done something extraordinary. It had turned human societies inside out. IT had shifted focus from sheer survival to organization, hierarchy, innovation, trade, ritual, and status. It had laid the groundwork for cities, elites, and long-distance networks. And it had taught humans how to manipulate not just the material world, but their own societies, from a green-tinted nugget in a hillside, to the hands of a master craftsman, to the grave of an elite. Copper had become central to the story of civilization itself. This part follows how copper wealth quietly turned neighbors into rivals and trust into suspicion. In settlements where copper had become a measure of status, power no longer announced itself loudly. It moved quietly. It traveled in whispers, in favors owed, in debts never written down. When copper was rare, everyone knew who possessed it. And when everyone knew, envy followed close behind. In one river valley settlement, archaeologists later noticed something strange in the burial record. Two households, both rich in copper tools and ornaments, had dominated the community for generations. Then suddenly one line vanished. Their home showed no signs of fire or invasion. Their tools were gone. Their graves were few, hastily prepared, missing the metal that once defined them. There were no weapons embedded in bones. No massacre, just absence that in societies without courts or written law, conflict didn't always explode. It dissolved. A rival might arrange for trade routes to shift away. A shipment of, or might never arrive. A trusted intermediary might betray a meeting place or delay help when it was most needed. A man sent to negotiate never returned from the hills. A woman carrying copper ornaments was found drowned in a shallow crossing where everyone knew the water was safe. People remembered these events, but they spoke of them carefully. Stories spread of craftsmen who knew too much, masters whose techniques were coveted beyond their households. A skilled copper worker could change the balance of power in a settlement, and so these individuals were protected or quietly removed. Some disappeared while traveling between communities. Others died, young under circumstances no one could explain, their workshops taken over by former apprentices who suddenly rose in status. Copper created a new kind of danger. Not open war, but targeted loss. Leaders learned that it was cheaper to remove a rival than to fight an entire village. If one influential figure vanished, alliances collapsed. Trade slowed. Authority weakened. The metal itself rarely changed hands in these moments. Instead, control over people did. Burial customs began to shift in response, that high-status individuals were buried with symbolic copper rather than full toolkits. Some graves held copper that had been deliberately bent, broken, or dulled. Objects no longer useful, but still powerful in meaning. Others were buried secretly at night, away from central cemeteries, to avoid drawing attention to how much metal the family still possessed. Paranoia became strategy. Copper was hidden under floors, sealed into walls, buried beneath hearths. Knowledge of where metal was stored was passed down orally, sometimes only to one heir. Families fragmented their wealth deliberately, spreading it across relatives and allies, so no single loss would be catastrophic. And then there were the stories people told children, stories of travelers who boasted too loudly about their copper and were never seen again. Of leaders who flaunted golden axes and died before the next harvest. Of settlements that grew rich too fast, attracting eyes they could not see watching them. None of this appears directly in the archaeological record, but its shadows do abrupt changes in household wealth. Workshops abandoned overnight. Elite graves that stop appearing without explanation. Fortifications built not after wars, but during periods of apparent peace. These are the fingerprints of quiet conflict, the kind born not from hunger, but from inequality. Copper had turned power into something personal, and once power became personal, trust became fragile. To be why the late Copper Age, communities understood a dangerous truth. Metal did not just build tools, it reshaped ambition. And ambition, once awakened, did not fade quietly. Copper had created winners, and winners created enemies. As copper became wealth, influence, and prestige, it also became a reason to build walls. Small settlements that once trusted neighbors now feared them. Archaeological layers reveal fortifications rising seemingly overnight. Mud brick walls doubling in thickness, towers added at corners, ditches dug around entire villages. And inside these walls, copper weapons accumulated, axes, spearheads, knives, not just tools, but symbols of readiness and deterrence. The more metal a community possessed, the more it attracted attention. Rival villages began building arsenals. Not every attack was immediate, but the threat was constant. A polished copper dagger was as much a warning as it was a weapon. Communities learned that survival wasn't just farming, hunting, or trading. It was having enough copper to protect, intimidate, and negotiate. The arms race extended to metallurgy itself. Craftsmen experimented with harder alloys, refined casting, and more efficient furnaces. A copper axe that could be reforged after battle was more valuable than a brittle one. Arrowheads could be tempered and sharpened repeatedly. And as techniques spread across regions, rival settlements attempted to keep pace, hiring itinerant smiths or sending apprentices to learn secrets from distant communities. Competition intensified in subtle, shadowy ways. Rumors of secret workshops persisted. Some villages claimed to possess furnaces that could melt or to unprecedented temperatures. Others whispered of individuals who could bend copper into shapes that no one else could replicate. Axes with curved blades, pins with intricate spirals, ceremonial vessels that seemed almost alive in their shine. These rumors, true or exaggerated, fueled envy, strategy, and sometimes quiet aggression. Even trade became weaponized. Communities with copper could withhold shipments to weaken rivals. Caravans were ambushed. Mines were sabotaged. Apprentices disappeared mid-journey, their knowledge lost or repurposed elsewhere. Every transaction held risk. Wealth could be gained, but danger always accompanied it. Copper was as much a target as a reward. And yet, this tension drove innovation like nothing else. Settlements developed complex layouts, workshops near walls for security, elevated platforms for surveillance, storage rooms hidden beneath homes. Fortifications were no longer mere defenses. They became instruments of social organization, concentrating power in the hands of those who controlled both metal and territory. Copper reshaped society in two simultaneous ways. It built wealth and prestige, allowing elites to consolidate power, but IT created insecurity and competition, forcing communities to organize, innovate, and protect themselves that in the hands of a single family. Copper could elevate them above neighbors, dictate trade, and influence decisions across the valley. But the same copper could also mark them as a target, forcing them to live with constant vigilance, secrecy, and strategy. That'd be why the late Copper Age, survival was no longer just about food, shelter, or alliances. It was about copper, how much you had, how well you controlled it, and how cleverly you defended it. Civilization, in its earliest form, was becoming inseparable from metal. Wealth, war, art, religion, all were tied together by the shine of copper. Be why the height of the Copper Age, settlements had grown beyond small clusters of homes. Entire communities sprawled across river valleys, with thousands of inhabitants living in close quarters. Archaeologists studying these sites notice something striking. Copper was at the center of it all. Not just tools, not just trade, but the very organization of society revolved around metal in some settlements. Workshops clustered near central plazas, visible to all. Copper axes, chisels, and ornaments were not hidden. They were displayed, a testament to the household's skill, wealth, and influence. Families controlling production wielded authority beyond their doors. They dictated trade, influenced marriages, and mediated disputes, all because copper gave them a monopoly on what everyone else wanted. Mass production emerged. Furnaces grew larger, molds more standardized. A single master could oversee dozens of apprentices, creating hundreds of axes, pins, or knives in a season. The sheer volume of production required organization. Workers divided by task, raw or transported from distant mines, finished goods cataloged and distributed. Communities began to resemble early industrial centers, centuries before industry would exist, and with scale came hierarchy. The wealthiest families didn't just own copper, they controlled access to it. They decided who would learn the trade, who would receive tools, and who would be allowed to trade. These families became almost untouchable, their influence extending across multiple villages. They could sponsor construction projects, fortify walls, or even arrange assassinations of rivals. Subtle, invisible, deadly, and historically plausible. Copper had become a weapon of both offense and influence. Competition drove specialization. Some communities focused on smelting and alloying, producing tools and weapons with advanced techniques. Others excelled in decorative work, bracelets, pins, ceremonial axes. Trade networks expanded, connecting distant settlements. Copper flowed outward, while ideas, methods, and styles flowed inward. Regions became dependent on one another, creating fragile balances of power. A single disrupted shipment of copper could destabilize an entire valley, but dependence bred tension. Rumors of poisoned copper, sabotage workshops, and missing shipments circulated like wildfire. Families invested in secrecy. Caches hidden beneath floors, decoy workshops, apprentices sworn to secrecy. Copper had become a currency of life and death. A stolen shipment could bankrupt a rival family, while a hidden store could secure dominance for generations. The archaeological record hints at this tension. Abandoned workshops, burned homes, and fortifications all appear in periods of high copper activity. Elite burials show families amassing tools and ornaments beyond what a household could use, a sign not just of wealth, but of preparation, security, and influence. Copper was not just metal. It was power crystallized into a tangible, portable, and dangerous form that ate this peak. Communities learned an unspoken lesson. Copper could elevate you, enrich you, and protect you, but it could also make you a target. Wealth, production, and secrecy were inseparable. Control of copper meant control of labor, trade, and even life itself. Copper had transformed villages into fortresses, crafts into industries, families into dynasties. Civilization had become inseparable from metal. There are places where archaeology falls silent, but memory doesn't. In one large copper-producing settlement near a river bend, later generations spoke of a man remembered only as the Copper Lord. No name survived, just the title. He wasn't a king in the way later ages would understand. There were no crowns, no thrones, but everyone knew his power. His household controlled the largest furnace, the deepest or caches, and the most skilled craftsmen. If you wanted copper, you went through him. And if you crossed him, copper disappeared from your life. Tools broke and were never replaced. Trade partners stopped arriving. Apprentices were quietly taken away, offered protection and food elsewhere, leaving rival workshops hollow and empty. No violence was seen, but the results were unmistakable. Families fell from influence in a single season. Then one winter, the furnace vanished, not destroyed, not burned, simply gone. The workshop was intact. The walls stood. The slag piles remained. But the furnace, the heart of production, had been dismantled stone by stone and removed. No one admitted knowing where it went. The Copper Lord himself was found weeks later, buried without ornament, without axe, without pin. A powerful man reduced to silence. After that, no single family ever again controlled all copper in that settlement. People learned that in another region, closer to the hills, stories told of a woman whose wealth came not from smelting, but from storage. She never worked copper herself. She bought it quietly, broken tools, damaged blades, dull axes, anything others considered waste. Over years, she amassed a hidden reserve. When conflict came and copper became scarce, she released it slowly, trading fragments for loyalty. When rival leaders fell ill or disappeared, people whispered that she had paid others in copper to remove obstacles. Not through open violence, but through promises, debts, and opportunity. Copper changed hands. So did fate. Her burial was never found. Some believe she was never buried at all, that her copper was scattered so widely that no grave could hold her legacy. Then there were the craftsmen who knew too much. One master smith, famous for casting blades that never warped, refused to teach his method. Apprentices watched closely, but something was always missing. One night, he disappeared. His home showed no struggle. His tools remained. But the mold, the one thing that mattered, was gone. Months later, a rival settlement began producing blades identical to his. People understood what had happened, even if no one said it aloud. Copper didn't just buy object, IT bought silence, IT bought loyalty, that IT bought disappearance. Communities adapted by turning copper into myth. Children were told stories of greedy men buried alive beneath their hoards, of families destroyed by flaunting metal, of settlements that grew rich too fast and burned themselves down to hide their wealth from enemies. Whether true or not didn't matter. The fear was real. Be why this stage. Copper ruled not only economies, but imagination. IT shaped how people trusted, how they feared, how they remembered. Power no longer needed armies. Sometimes it only needed a single piece of metal placed in the right hands. And everyone knew this truth, even if they never spoke it. Copper doesn't kill. People do. When copper gives them the means. Be why the time settlements reached their peak. Copper was everywhere, in weapons, tools, ornaments, and hidden caches. Yet the very abundance that had built empires now created fear. Families measured neighbors not by words or deeds, but by the weight of their copper stores. Trust became a currency rarer than metal itself. Whispers of betrayal filled the air. Apprentices vanished. Merchants misplaced shipments. Copper lords awoke to find their workshops ransacked, not by armies, but by stealthy intruders. People who knew the secret paths, the hidden doors, the unguarded caches. Rumors spread of shadow networks. Groups paid to monitor competitors, sabotage furnaces, or even poison those who knew too much. In one famed story, a settlement known later as Silverford of the Copper Age reportedly fell silent for months. Archaeologists today uncover the aftermath. Burned workshops, scorched houses, and enormous slag piles left half-finished. Contemporary accounts, oral, reconstructed by later scribes, hint that the richest family ordered the assassination of their rivals, paying a network of mercenaries in copper itself. Copper bars, beads, and ceremonial tools. To do the deed, some nights, the bodies were found carefully displayed in courtyards. Not for ritual, not for horror, but as warnings. This is what happens to those who hold too much copper. Fear spread faster than fire. Copper also created envy that traveled a neighboring settlement. Seeing Silverford's wealth sent emissaries to negotiate, but they were never seen again. Later, fragments of their cargo, copper pins, and unfinished axes were discovered buried under floorboards, suggesting betrayal from within. Families learned to hide production, fragment their stores, and secretly train apprentices outside the village, far from prying eyes. Yet even secrecy could not prevent internal collapse. Mistrust seeped into marriage arrangements, trade partnerships, and communal decisions. Villagers hoarded food, water, and copper. Apprentices were judged not on skill, but on loyalty. Alliances were fleeting, broken by rumors of missing copper or imagined slights. By the time the next harvest arrived, some settlements were already hollowed out, their labor force decimated by paranoia and internal strife. And the most dramatic tension. Copper itself became almost sacred and cursed at once. Legends spoke of the green shine that kills, a reference to oxidized copper left too long in storage. Families would bury objects for protection, fearing that possessing too much copper might invite disaster. Some secret societies supposedly arose, sworn to balance production and consumption, mediating disputes over copper and punishing those who hoarded excessively. Stories tell of men vanishing in the night, only to leave behind a single copper token, a warning to others that by this stage, it was no longer about survival, agriculture, or trade alone. Communities had built elaborate systems to manage, defend, and sometimes weaponize copper. Yet the very same metal that had once created wealth, stability, and prestige now carried the seeds of fear, betrayal, and collapse. Even today, when archaeologists uncover layers of abandoned workshops and scattered copper, one can almost feel the tension. Wealth and paranoia, ambition and fear, coexisting in a fragile equilibrium that could shatter at any moment. Copper had transformed society into a game of shadows. One misstep, one missing shipment, one betrayal, and entire communities could collapse overnight. First, conflict over copper stayed small. A missing shipment, a rival family erased quietly. A workshop burned in the night. But as generations passed, something changed. Copper stopped being a household issue and became a regional one. Entire valleys began to define themselves by how much metal they controlled and how willing they were to defend it. Settlements near rich copper veins grew arrogant. Their walls rose higher. Their warriors carried better weapons. Their leaders spoke with confidence because they knew something others did not. Without copper, no community could survive at scale anymore. And communities without copper understood this too. So the first real wars did not begin with ideology, religion, or conquest. They began with mines. One mountain pass, narrow and steep, became infamous in later oral tradition. On one side stood a city built almost entirely on copper wealth. Workshops ringing the settlement, slag piles taller than houses, guards posted day and night along the paths leading uphill. On the other side, a coalition of smaller communities that had been cut off from trade. They had food, they had people, but they had no metal. They attacked at dawn, not to occupy the city, not to rule it. Their goal was simpler and more brutal: destroy the mine, collapse the shafts, poison the access routes. If they couldn't have copper, no one would. The fighting lasted days. Archaeological layers show bodies buried hastily, copper weapons bent or broken, fortifications repaired again and again. When the attackers finally retreated, the mine entrance had been sealed under tons of rock. The city survived, but its wealth never recovered. That lesson spread fast. Soon, cities began attacking not each other's walls, but each other's lifelines. Mines were sabotaged, timber supports burned, smelting areas flooded, or caravans ambushed miles from settlements, their guards killed, their cargo scattered or buried so no one else could retrieve it. This wasn't war for land, it was war for metal. Entire regions polarized. Copper-rich cities formed alliances, pledging mutual defense of mines and trade routes. Copper-poor communities banded together, launching coordinated raids meant to destabilize production. For the first time, warfare became planned beyond a single season. Leaders stockpiled weapons. Young men trained year-round. Scouts mapped terrain not for hunting, but for attack. Some oral traditions speak of mine wars that lasted decades. One story tells of two river cities, both dependent on the same distant copper source. When drought reduced agricultural output, trade slowed. Accusations followed. One city claimed the other was hoarding copper. Negotiations failed. Then a caravan was found slaughtered halfway between them. And one admitted responsibility. Within a year, both cities were fortified. Within 2, fields near the roads were abandoned. By the 5th year, both cities had lost half their population, not to battle, but to famine, migration, and internal collapse. The mine still existed, but no one was strong enough to fully control it. Copper had turned allies into enemies without a single declaration of war. And then there were the early countries. Not nations as we know them, but networks, clusters of cities bound by copper, trade, and shared military interest. These proto-polities controlled river corridors, mountain passes, and coastlines. They standardized weapon types. They trained warriors to use specific copper axes and spearheads. Their leaders measured power not in people, but in output. How much copper per season? How many weapons per year? When two such networks collided, the scale of violence shocked even contemporaries. Burn layers stretch across entire regions dating to the same decades. Settlements destroyed not once, but repeatedly. Mines abandoned under guard. Their entrances sealed deliberately so rivals could never exploit them. Mass graves containing copper weapons stacked together, as if even in death, metal had meaning. Some communities responded with terror. They spread rumors that their copper was cursed. They displayed broken weapons at borders, warning attackers that taking their metal would bring disaster. Others went further, deliberately flooding mines or collapsing shafts permanently, choosing poverty over annihilation. But the wars did not stop. Because copper was no longer optional, agriculture relied on copper tools. Defense relied on copper weapons. Authority relied on copper symbols. Remove copper, and society itself unraveled. Leaders knew this, and so did their enemies. Be why this stage. Children grew up knowing only a world shaped by metal and fear. Songs remembered lost cities. Stories warned of mines that swallowed armies. Elders spoke of a time before copper ruled everything, but no one could imagine returning to it. Copper had crossed a threshold that IT was no longer a resource, IT was no longer wealth, that IT was no longer even power, that IT was destiny. Why now? Copper had become more than wealth. It had become obsession, and obsession breeds extremes. Across valleys, rivers, and hills, settlements once thriving began to fracture. Families hoarded metal. Craftsmen disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Traders were ambushed. Entire cities no longer trusted outsiders, or even their own neighbors. One tale tells of a settlement in the northern hills, called in later legends Red Forge. The city was small, but the copper veins beneath it were among the richest known. At first, Red Forge grew prosperous. Its walls were lined with workshops. Its streets sparkled with copper pins, knives, and ornaments. Families competed to display wealth. Apprentices learned fast, forging blades so finely balanced they seemed magical. Then came the first great theft on a single night. No one saw the perpetrators. The copper storehouses were empty by morning. Though the gates had been locked, the guards doubled, and the city's walls unbroken. Suspicion turned inward. Families accused one another. Leaders demanded confessions. People disappeared. Some were never found. By the next season, the city had lost more than a quarter of its population to exile, murder, or forced labor. The metal had been reclaimed by outsiders, or perhaps by insiders so desperate they betrayed their own. Red Forge did not recover. Other settlements watched this tragedy, and fear spread faster than copper itself. Cities began to attack preemptively, sometimes burning neighboring workshops simply to ensure rivals would never outpace them. One story survives of a river city that marched to its neighbor under cover of fog, smashing kilns, destroying molds, and scattering copper into the river. The river turned green for weeks. Children would later say it looked like a metal curse flowing between the two settlements, warning anyone who dared take copper too lightly, "That be why this time." Stories claim wars erupted not just city to city, but mine to mine. Copper veins, once sources of quiet prosperity, became fortified zones. Sentinels watched the shafts day and night. Traps were laid to collapse tunnels for rivals. Armies of peasants, not trained soldiers, were conscripted to guard the ore. Rumors persist, likely exaggerated, but chilling, that some mines were poisoned to prevent anyone from using the copper. Pits flooded with water, or smoke introduced to suffocate intruders. Some mines were deliberately collapsed after a single family had claimed all, or leaving enormous mounds of rock as warnings to others. The chaos did not stay local. Copper-driven conflicts began to span regions that later became entire countries. In legends pieced together from artifacts and oral traditions, settlements from the Anatolian highlands to the Black Sea coast, and as far as the river plains near modern-day Bulgaria and Romania, began vying for control over the same copper veins. Diplomacy became rare. Raiding parties moved hundreds of kilometers. Caravans of copper, escorted by dozens of armed men, were attacked in broad daylight. Those who survived brought back tales of entire towns wiped out for a single shipment of metal. In one particularly striking story, likely a blend of rumor and memory, a city along the northern coast supposedly paid a neighboring settlement a lifetime of copper to assassinate the head of a rival metallurgical family. The assassination succeeded, but the murder ignited a war that lasted decades. Generations of children grew up only knowing the war. Copper from their veins funded mercenaries, fortified walls, and bribes to neighboring cities. By the time peace returned, the original mine that had started the conflict was abandoned, sealed beneath rubble. The wealth irretrievably lost. In another case, the southern valleys tell of the curse of the molten horn. A family claimed to possess a furnace capable of producing flawless copper weapons, axes that would never dull, chisels that would cut stone as easily as clay. Envy spread across neighboring valleys. Attempts to steal the furnace failed. Each raid ended in fire or death. Eventually, the family disappeared entirely. Their furnace, it is said, was hidden in a cavern filled with traps and carvings warning that anyone who touched it would die within a year. Traders whispered that the furnace still existed, that copper objects appearing elsewhere were secretly forged from its remnants. Copper was no longer a material. It was a story, a threat, a currency of life and death. Settlements adapted. Some communities deliberately reduced their output, fearing that producing too much metal would invite attack. Others created hidden caches, distributing ore and artifacts across forests, rivers, and hills to avoid centralization. Yet even secrecy could not stop the wars. Caravans intercepted across long distances ensured that no family or settlement ever felt completely safe. Alliances were fragile. Trust was bought and sold, sometimes in copper itself, sometimes in human lives. The intensity of these conflicts created a dark side of society rarely seen before. Mercenary groups formed, not for wealth alone, but for the opportunity to seize copper. They moved between valleys, kingdoms, and rivers, taking contracts from anyone who could pay. It is said that some mercenary captains maintained personal hordes so vast that their presence alone could tip the balance of war. Cities trembled at the arrival of a single caravan bearing a known mercenary, fearing both attack and sabotage. Even entire countries, loose confederations of cities bound by trade and mutual defense, began to collapse from within, not due to external enemies, but because copper caused paranoia, envy, and betrayal. Leaders feared rivals more than outsiders. Families withheld apprentices. Craftsmen vanished, leaving entire workshops idle. Legends speak of entire populations abandoning settlements overnight, carrying whatever copper they could, leaving houses, kilns, and workshops to rot in the SUNWY now. The obsession with copper shaped every part of life. Marriages were negotiated based on metal holdings. Diplomacy was dictated by who controlled the richest veins. Harvests failed not due to climate alone, but because fields were abandoned for the defense of mines. Children were taught to respect copper not only as wealth, but as a dangerous authority capable of killing friends, families, and rulers alike. And so the pattern repeated, city to city, mine to mine, valley to valley, settlement to settlement. Copper did not just enrich, copper commanded. Some archaeologists today find massive slag heaps far from known settlements and speculate that they are the remnants of mines abandoned in panic. Others uncover layers of burned houses and workshops, indicating sudden destruction. Oral traditions passed down centuries later speak of entire copper wars that lasted lifetimes, leaving cities hollow, population scattered, and riches buried or lost. Yet the allure of copper never faded. Even in the darkest stories, even in the burned and abandoned settlements, the promise of metal, tools, weapons, ornaments pulled people back. Greed and necessity drove exploration of forgotten veins, daring raids into enemy territory, and the creation of new alliances bound only by the lust for copper. It became a cycle. Copper created wealth. Wealth bred envy. Envy led to betrayal. Betrayal caused war. War destroyed production. And then copper, hidden or forgotten, would lure the next generation into the same deadly patterns. The continent was caught in this cycle for centuries, a slow spiral driven by a single, deceptively simple element. Copper.by now. Copper was no longer just a tool or a luxury. It had become the heartbeat of civilization itself. Entire families were measured by their copper holdings. Entire valleys rose or fell, depending on the veins beneath them. Entire river networks became battlegrounds, not just for trade, but for control of the veins themselves. Legends passed down through generations tell of the first copper dynasties, families who claimed not just a mine, but the lives and loyalty of everyone around it. Some say the dynasty of Ironcrest in the Northern Highlands began with a single visionary, a man who discovered a vein so rich, so pure, that he could produce more metal than any neighboring settlement. He built walls higher than any had seen, trained warriors not to fight enemies, but to protect copper, and formed secret alliances with nearby valleys, offering some metal in exchange for loyalty. But his own ambitions seeded betrayal. According to stories, his youngest son, tempted by whispers from rival valleys, plotted in secret. He convinced mercenaries from a distant river settlement to strike at the central forge during a festival. The attack succeeded. Half the workshop burned. Slag spilled into the river, poisoning fish and water alike. The patriarch survived, but never recovered. The family was split, two sons claiming separate territories, fighting over the same veins. And thus, the first great copper civil war began, lasting decades. Meanwhile, across the continent, other settlements had noticed the rising influence of dynasties. Rivers that once facilitated trade became patrol routes. Bridges were guarded with copper-plated barriers. Couriers carried messages of alliance and threats, always with copper tokens as guarantees. Lose the token, and your life could be next. Entire fleets of wooden riverboats were armed with bronze-tipped spears. Their crews trained not to fish or trade, but to raid and defend copper caravans. WY this time, stories say, even small communities dared to act like kingdoms. One valley, called Silva Wind in later chronicles, had no significant copper veins of its own, but they were cunning. They built secret tunnels to reach a neighboring valley's mine, stealing or under cover of night. When discovered, they didn't fight directly. They used sabotage, flooding the mine, collapsing shafts, and releasing copper-laden smoke that suffocated workers. The neighboring city never forgave them, and a war erupted that lasted nearly a generation. Some tales claim that entire armies marched not for conquest, but just to gain enough metal to sustain production. Meanwhile, rumor became a weapon. Traders whispered of mines cursed by angry spirits, of families that vanished overnight, of copper so valuable it could buy loyalty, murder, or even entire cities. Mercenaries and spies were everywhere. Some settlements paid vast amounts of copper just to hire assassins to eliminate rival family heads. Others staged fake attacks to mask thefts, making rivals suspect ghosts, sabotage, or divine punishment rather than human cunning. Entire valleys became paranoid, locking away copper in underground vaults with traps that could kill anyone who tried to steal IT in these decades. Copper became the standard for both diplomacy and terror. Peace treaties were sealed with copper gifts. Betrayals were punished by copper confiscation. Sometimes a single shipment could bankrupt a city. Copper hoards became living weapons. City leaders would threaten each other with destruction of reserves, knowing it could spark famine, rebellion, or civil war. And then came the First Continental-Scale Copper War, an event later described in legends as the Green Flame Conflicts. It began with the discovery of an immense copper deposit along a mountain ridge that touched 3 river networks, and thus 3 emerging countries or coalitions of settlements. The richest vein anyone had ever seen, one coalition, called the High Peak Alliance, mobilized armies along the rivers, fortifying key points to control access. Another, the Riverine Lords, sent spies, sabotage teams, and disguised miners to undermine the High Peak operations. At a third, the Coastal Syndicate used maritime routes to intercept caravans carrying or from both the High Peak and Riverine territories, attacking warehouses and ambushing transports. The war didn't just destroy property, it shaped geography. Mines were intentionally flooded, rivers were dammed or diverted. Forests were cut to prevent hiding places for enemy raiders, leaving entire valleys barren. Some cities burned so completely that the slag heaps still stand centuries later as silent monuments to the conflict. Amid this chaos, copper dynasties created shadow networks of influence. Families in one valley secretly funded raiders in another. Couriers carried false maps and rumors, misdirecting attacks, while the real strikes targeted rivals' workshops. Some settlements hired entire mercenary armies from distant regions. Clans that spoke different languages wielded unfamiliar weapons, but fought for copper alone. The wars became less about territory and more about metal, and copper itself began to dictate strategy, alliances, and even the rise and fall of rulers. The psychological toll was immense. Families grew distrustful of neighbors and even siblings. Some settlements abandoned villages near old mines, fearing revenge attacks. Others went to extreme lengths to hide production. Underground smelting furnaces, secret workshops, tunnels connecting valley to valley. Oral traditions tell of entire families living beneath the earth for years, emerging only to transport refined copper to distant cities, then vanishing again. And still, the wars escalated. Some countries became almost entirely defined by their access to copper. Legends say that armies would march hundreds of kilometers, not for land or food, but to claim a single rich vein. Caravans carrying copper were accompanied by dozens of spies, double agents, and assassins. Rival leaders engaged in copper diplomacy, treaties sealed with copper ingots, betrayals punished by murder, entire settlements razed because they failed to deliver promised, or mercenary captains became legendary figures. Some are said to have commanded forces of over 1,000 men, moving like shadows between valleys and rivers, never staying in one place, collecting copper for whoever could pay, or assassinating leaders for a rival faction to destabilize the competition. Certain names, remembered in myth, are said to have amassed enough copper to fund wars that lasted decades. Yet their identity vanished into legend, leaving only tales of impossible wealth and terrifying influence by the time this age drew on. Historians or storytellers later noted that copper had reshaped not just settlements, but entire cultures. Trade routes were now dictated by the location of veins. Alliances were forged and broken on the promise of metal. Families rose to legendary status, or disappeared overnight. Cities were abandoned, burned, or rebuilt, always with copper at the center of every decision. Even ordinary people, farmers, weavers, potters, were affected. They carried copper coins, tools, and weapons, not because they wanted them, but because survival depended on being useful in a world where copper was law, wealth, and weapon all in one. Some stories claim that by the end of this period, entire generations had never known a life without war over copper. Children were trained to fight, smelt, or hide metal before they could read or write. Elders warned of cursed veins, haunted workshops, and mercenaries who would strike without mercy. Legends describe hidden hoards of copper so vast that a single family could command entire valleys. And yet, every generation, it was always at risk. The stage was set for an even more dramatic expansion of copper warfare, reaching not just cities, valleys, or regions, but continents, rivers, and coasts. Copper had transformed from a simple resource into a force that dictated history itself, shaping politics, society, and even human psychology. And still, the obsession was far from over. The stories say that the next generations would escalate everything. Massive armies, hidden vaults, underground empires, and wars so vast that no one could predict who would survive or who would control the richest veins on the planet by this time. Copper was no longer merely a tool, a status symbol, or a commodity. It had become the lifeblood of civilizations. Entire dynasties were born from a single rich vein. Entire populations lived or died, depending on who controlled it. Legends tell of the Copper Throne, a symbolic title claimed by rulers who controlled multiple mines, riverways, and trade routes. It was said that whoever held the Copper Throne could dictate the fate of entire regions without ever drawing a sword, for copper itself was the sword. The first great copper empire, known in myths as the Shimmering Dominion, rose in the northern river valleys. Its founder, a cunning man named Aldemar, discovered a series of veins that stretched across 3 mountain ranges. According to stories, he didn't just claim the mines. He built secret tunnels connecting them, enabling caravans to move copper without ever leaving underground paths. Rival leaders, unaware of these hidden networks, were tricked into attacking ghost settlements, only to find empty houses, destroyed forgeries, and soldiers lying in wait. Aldemar's empire was not built on brute force alone. Diplomacy, espionage, and subterfuge became his weapons. Families from neighboring valleys were bribed with copper to betray their own kin. Mercenaries were paid not just in coins, but in promises of exclusive access to mines, and spies disguised as traders spread rumors of curses, rebellions, and ghosts to destabilize rivals. Some stories claim that Aldemar once orchestrated a citywide assassination, convincing an entire city council to poison themselves, believing it was a divine punishment for failing to deliver copper. But the empire's expansion ignited continent-wide conflict. The southern valleys, rich in ores but fragmented into rival clans, could not match the Shimmering Dominion's network of spies and mercenaries. In desperation, they formed the Crimson Pact, a coalition of clans united solely to challenge Aldemar's dominance. Wars raged for decades. Battles were fought not only at river crossings and fortified mines, but within cities themselves, as rival agents set fire to workshops, destroyed smelting furnaces, and assassinated mine overseers. Legend tells of a night of 1,000 flames, a battle where the Crimson Pact attempted a coordinated strike on 5 major mines simultaneously. Fires blazed across the mountains for weeks. Entire forests burned, rivers choked with slag, and villages were abandoned as populations fled. Aldemar's forces, however, had anticipated the assault. Using underground tunnels and secret vantage points, they countered each attack with precision, capturing key leaders of the Crimson Pact and sending their severed copper rings back as warnings to the remaining rebels in the wake of such wars. Copper itself became a currency of intimidation and prestige. Families hoarded it not just to make tools or ornaments, but to wield influence. Tales of the copper vaults of Aldemar circulated for generations. Underground fortresses so secure that one misstep would collapse entire tunnels. It was said that some vaults contained enough metal to equip an army of 10,000 with weapons, tools, and armor. Yet they were defended by traps, false tunnels, and mercenaries who would kill anyone attempting to steal even a single ingot. While northern and southern regions waged these legendary wars, eastern settlements began to harness copper in new ways. They discovered that alloying copper with small amounts of tin or arsenic created metals harder than pure copper. These early experiments gave rise to weapons that could last longer, repair faster, and cut deeper. Armies began marching not with obsidian or flint, but with bronze-tipped spears and axes, giving the eastern factions an edge in battles that once favored sheer numbers. The East-West trade network emerged from necessity. Copper mines in the north, tin deposits in the east, and salt-rich plains in the south required coordination. Traders became spies. Mercenaries became diplomats. Secret contracts were sealed with copper ingots, with clauses written in invisible codes only certain families could read. Some families even went as far as paying rivals to assassinate allies, using the confusion to grab mines unnoticed. Entire generations of children grew up hearing stories of these wars. They learned early to smelt copper in secret, hide ingots under floors, and read the subtle signs of approaching danger: smoke patterns, missing livestock, or a sudden quiet in the forests. Folk tales warned of the copper shadows, mercenary clans who would appear at night, strike swiftly, and vanish with entire shipments of metal, leaving only charred homes as proof. Some myths describe sea-bound copper wars as well. Coastal settlements, eager to control river mouths and trade routes, built fleets of wooden vessels, some equipped with copper-reinforced hulls and bronze ram spikes. Naval battles raged along rivers and shallow coastal waters, with copper-clad ships ramming merchant convoys, while city leaders coordinated attacks from hidden fortresses overlooking the water. By this time, copper had begun shaping governments themselves. Dynasties that controlled mines became de facto monarchs, demanding tribute, exacting labor from populations, and creating armies solely for the protection or conquest of metal resources. Some cities, dependent on imported copper, became puppet states, forced to send young artisans, smelting experts, and raw or to more powerful neighbors in exchange for protection or basic food supplies. The scale of the wars reached its peak with the so-called War of the Five Rivers, a conflict that would later be described in epic poetry and oral histories. 5 major river networks, each with its own copper-producing settlements, became locked in a cycle of attack and counterattack. Cities were burned, rivers poisoned with slag, and entire communities disappeared. Ambassadors betrayed one another. Assassins infiltrated councils. Mercenary armies moved across continents, their allegiance determined only by copper payments. Stories claim that during this period, some rulers began issuing contracts for murder and sabotage, paying extraordinary amounts of copper to eliminate rivals. A famous tale speaks of Lord Calvar of the Northern Peaks, who allegedly paid a caravan of masked assassins to infiltrate a neighboring city and destroy the main smelting furnace. The attack succeeded, plunging the city into chaos for decades. But legend says that Calvar's own son was kidnapped in retaliation, forcing a delicate negotiation of copper and promises of loyalty to regain him. And yet, through all this chaos, civilization advanced. Copper workshops evolved into metallurgical academies. Families who once fought over mines began experimenting with alloys, decorative techniques, and even early proto-engineering projects. Entire regions developed standard measurements, administrative systems, and early record-keeping to manage the increasingly complex production and trade of metal. Wars forged innovation. Assassinations forged secrecy. Betrayals forged cunning. Copper had become both weapon and teacher, reshaping human society in ways no stone tool ever could. Even distant lands, initially untouched, felt the effects. Traders carried copper ingots hundreds of kilometers, spreading influence, techniques, and stories. The legend of the Copper Thrones traveled faster than armies, inspiring younger rulers to seek veins, craft weapons, or orchestrate intricate conspiracies. Entire cultures became defined by how they mined, smelted, and defended their copper, creating a web of interconnected civilizations that depended on, feared, and worshipped metal as both wealth and power. And still, this was just the beginning of copper's true age of domination. The dynasties, wars, assassinations, and empires would continue for generations, escalating in scale and ambition, until even rivers themselves seemed to be drawn into the conflicts. Families that controlled a single mine began claiming territories hundreds of kilometers away. Cities once independent were swallowed into copper coalitions, and mercenary networks became permanent features of political life. Copper was no longer a metal. It had become fate itself, by the time the copper empires had fully risen. The world was no longer a collection of small villages scraping by. It had become a sprawling network of cities, fortresses, and hidden tunnels, all orbiting around the lustrous metal. The wealthiest rulers no longer saw copper as a mere material. It was life, power, and immortality all at once. Families built dynasties with it. Armies equipped themselves with it. And empires rose and fell depending on the control of a single vein that in the north, the descendants of Aldemar, known as the Ironhorn Line, had consolidated control over 20 of the richest mines. But power breeds envy. Across the mountains, a rival family called the Bloodvale clan emerged, claiming rights to mines that had once belonged to their ancestors. The rivalry wasn't fought with simple sieges. Instead, it became a war of cunning and shadows. Assassins were sent into cities disguised as traders, forging letters from other families, setting fires in workshops, and poisoning rival smelters. Some stories say that entire cities were lost in a single night because Aldemar's descendants had bribed the water carriers to release toxic copper-infused dust into the river, a tactic that left the population sickened, while his army took control of the valley with minimal resistance. Meanwhile, in the southern plains, the Crimson-packed remnants had rebuilt their coalitions, forming a network of copper mafias. They didn't just mine, they controlled trade routes, collected taxes on shipments, and even brokered secret deals with northern dynasties. Legend tells of merchant caravans disguised as wedding processions, carrying hundreds of copper ingots across hostile territories, using music and spectacle to distract potential attackers while elite guards moved the real cargo, hidden beneath wagons. The wars between these factions escalated beyond cities. Entire kingdoms, which today we'd call regions, were drawn into the conflict. Families claimed ancestral copper across borders, and disputes turned into continental-scale conflicts. One infamous campaign, known as the Siege of the Twin Mines, lasted over a decade. The northern Ironhorn Line besieged the southern Bloodvale stronghold, digging trenches, building tunnels under the city walls, and secretly flooding mines to force surrender. In retaliation, the Bloodvale clan bribed Aldemar's own lieutenants, leading to internal uprisings where soldiers turned against their commanders. The siege became a legendary tale of espionage, betrayal, and copper-fueled ingenuity. But copper wars were not just fought with armies. Assassinations shaped the map as much as battles. Chroniclers, some real, some invented, tell of contracts worth entire villages of copper. A merchant family might pay a rival a fortune in ingots simply to eliminate the son of a neighboring lord, ensuring that a mine passed to their own hands. Sometimes these plots failed spectacularly, leaving entire cities under lockdown, streets empty for months, and spies executed in public squares as a warning. Other times, contracts succeeded in ways so subtle that a mine could change hands without a single drop of blood being publicly seen. Copper silently shifting power behind closed doors. The coastal regions were no exception. Ports became strategic choke points where copper flowed like currency and diplomacy mingled with violence. The port of Saltmarsh Bay, perched on a rocky cliff, became infamous for its Copper Guild of Shadows, a mercenary organization that claimed to be neutral, but in reality worked for whoever paid the most. Tales describe them sabotaging entire fleets, sinking ships carrying copper to rival ports, faking storms with clever pyrotechnics, and even bribing lighthouses to mislead mariners into treacherous reefs. Their motto, according to legend, was, "Copper rules the land, and whoever controls the water controls the people." Across continents, trade became the battlefield itself. The northern mines produced raw ingots. The southern plains smelted them into tools and weapons, and eastern regions experimented with alloys. Copper caravans, escorted by elite guards clad in bronze and copper armor, moved along secret roads to avoid detection. But rival families were always watching. Some employed double agents disguised as miners, who would infiltrate camps to poison furnaces, replace ingots with fakes, or sabotage transportation animals. These acts of sabotage often sparked full-blown wars between cities that had once been allies. And the intrigue didn't stop there. The Copper Thrones, symbolic rulers who held sway over multiple mines, were targets of assassination as often as they were builders of empires. Stories abound of lords who were poisoned with copper-infused wine or stabbed with bronze daggers cast in secret molds by rival smelters. Entire dynasties fell because a single heir failed to secure the loyalty of his metallurgists or mercenaries. Some rulers, paranoid and obsessed, built entire palaces underground, with secret smelting chambers and tunnels that led to every major mine under their control. These underground fortresses became legends, whispered about in villages hundreds of kilometers away, with stories claiming that any intruder would trigger a series of hidden copper traps capable of collapsing entire halls. Yet, amid this chaos, innovation flourished. Wars forced metallurgists to experiment, combining copper with arsenic, tin, or even trace gold to create alloys stronger than pure copper. Craftsmen devised copper armor that could resist arrows, tools that could cut through hardwood like butter, and weapons that, in legends, were nearly indestructible. Entire military strategies were built around copper supply lines. Armies marched only as far as their copper wagons could travel, and battles were often won not by skill, but by control over the metal itself. Even cultural life became entwined with copper. Cities erected monuments, temples, and statues made entirely of copper. Wealthy rulers commissioned copper masks, ceremonial axes, and gilded vessels, not merely for aesthetics, but as symbols of power and deterrence. Some legends speak of secret festivals where assassins and mercenaries were paid off with ceremonial copper, ensuring loyalty while intimidating potential rebels. Copper had become more than a metal. It was myth, currency, weapon, and religion all at once. Entire generations grew up believing that to own copper was to own destiny. Families educated their children not just in smelting or trade, but in strategic thinking, diplomacy, and assassination, ensuring that they would inherit both minds and the cunning to protect them. Oral histories claim that children as young as 10 were taught to forge tiny copper daggers, read maps of hidden tunnels, and recognize the signs of spies or rival armies. That by the end of this period, the world had transformed. Rivers, mountains, and valleys were no longer mere geography. They were chessboards for copper empires. Mines dictated alliances, cities were built or destroyed for metal, and every political decision, marriage, treaty, war, was colored by the pursuit of copper. The legends even suggest that some early countries of the era were defined less by people and more by the territories of mines they could claim, with borders drawn not by rivers or forests but by our veins. And yet, despite all this bloodshed, espionage, and greed, the relentless human ingenuity sparked by copper led to technology, administration, and artistry that would shape civilizations for millennia. Every assassination, siege, and clandestine caravan created lessons in metallurgy, logistics, and governance. Copper had become a teacher, a tyrant, and the engine of human progress. a force as coveted and feared as the sun itself. While the Copper empires waged their wars, and assassins crept through cities under the veil of night, there was a legend whispered among metallurgists, merchants, and spies alike, a secret so coveted that even kings feared to speak its name: the Emerald Copper Codex. According to the tales, this was not merely a book, but a map and instruction manual combined, a guide that detailed the location of the richest copper veins across continents, as well as the secrets to crafting alloys stronger than any sword or tool known to humankind. The origins of the Codex were shrouded in mystery. Some claimed it was written by an ancient metallurgist priest who had traveled from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Mesopotamia, documenting everything he learned from craftsmen, alchemists, and shamans. Others believed it had been passed down by a secret society, known only as the Circle of Veins, who used the Codex to manipulate kings, engineers, and assassins for generations. The Codex itself was rumored to be bound in copper plates inlaid with emeralds, the metal reacting to heat in ways that could encode or erase sections depending on the wielder's skill. As the Copper Wars raged, multiple factions sought the Codex. The Ironhorn line believed it could guarantee control of every northern mine, while the Bloodveil clan hoped it would allow them to strike preemptively, ending generations of siege warfare. Coastal mercenaries and smugglers from Saltmarsh Bay claimed to know secret fragments of the map, trading snippets of knowledge for caravans of copper and silver. And in the mountains of Anatolia, rumors spoke of hidden temples where the Codex was protected by traps that melted intruders' copper tools on contact, leaving nothing but molten metal and a warning engraved in ancient glyphs. One tale tells of a young metallurgist named Kalen, who grew up in the shadow of the Ironhorn line. Unlike his peers, Kalen was obsessed not with wealth or power, but with the Codex's metallurgical secrets. Using information gleaned from merchants and spies, he discovered a lost underground smelting chamber beneath the twin mines, a place said to contain a fragment of the Codex etched into copper plates. When Kalen entered the chamber, he found inscriptions describing alloys that could turn copper nearly as hard as iron, along with formulas for copper-gold alloys that retain malleability. The kind of secret that could change the balance of power between empires. Kalen's discovery, however, did not remain secret for long. Word spread, reaching the ears of rival dynasties, who sent elite assassins to recover the fragment. The chamber itself became a battlefield. Poisoned smoke, collapsing tunnels, and hidden spikes turned the subterranean mine into a deadly trap. According to some accounts, Kalen survived by melting copper rods and forging them into makeshift weapons, fighting off intruders until the tunnels collapsed and buried the fragment once more. Meanwhile, far across the seas, the Codex influenced a different network entirely. The coastal ports of Lemnos and Lesbos, previously hubs of maritime copper trade, became centers of a shadow war between merchant guilds, each trying to intercept knowledge of the Codex. They employed shipborne assassins who could board rival vessels under the cover of night, using grappling hooks, hidden spears, and even copper-tipped nets designed to entangle enemies. Ships that carried fragments of the Codex were said to vanish mysteriously in fog or storms, leaving nothing behind but empty decks and broken copper ingots. The influence of the Codex even reached the emerging mega-settlements of southeastern Europe. In the Cucutini Tripilia cities, elite families supposedly hired secret scribes to encode copper tablets with false maps, intending to mislead enemies while keeping the real knowledge hidden. Some fragments allegedly indicated mines in remote mountains that did not exist, sending rival armies on futile expeditions while the families controlling the Codex enriched themselves with undisputed copper deposits. Legend tells that entire wars, some lasting decades, were sparked by misunderstandings over the Codex. Cities fought over claimed locations of secret mines, while dynasties assassinated heirs in hopes of gaining an advantage. At least 2 kingdoms in Anatolia were rumored to have fallen entirely because they trusted a forged map from the Codex, marching thousands of soldiers into mountain passes only to be ambushed by mercenaries who knew the truth. The Codex also introduced a subtle kind of psychological warfare. Rivals would leave copper plates inscribed with ominous warnings in the streets of enemy cities. Your veins will empty, your halls will fall, and the emerald watches all. The messages were designed to terrify rulers into submission, making them pay vast tributes of copper to avoid invasion or sabotage. Some families reportedly went bankrupt trying to appease this unseen force, illustrating that the Codex was as much a tool of fear as of knowledge. And yet, despite all the wars, assassinations, and espionage, the Codex's secrets continued to spread, though in fragmented form. Smugglers sold pieces to distant lands. Metallurgists experimented with alloys based on cryptic inscriptions, and explorers ventured into uncharted regions in search of mines hinted at by the fragments. Across continents, the story of copper became intertwined with myth, ambition, and greed, with the Codex acting as both the spark and the guide. That be why the end of this saga, historians, both real and imagined, claim that the Copper Wars shaped the map of ancient civilizations from Anatolia to the Balkans and even across the Mediterranean. Entire dynasties owed their rise to fragments of a book they might never fully possess. Cities were leveled over its promises, and families were assassinated for whispers of its location. Copper was no longer just metal. It was the ultimate arbiter of life, death, and destiny as the Copper Wars consumed Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean coast. Whispers of the Emerald Copper Codex spread farther than anyone could imagine. Traders, smugglers, and spies carried fragments of knowledge to distant lands. Egypt, the Indus Valley, and even the eastern mountains of the Zagros. Entire regions became unwitting players in a game they did not fully understand. Their cities and armies manipulated by the lure of copper and the secrets of the Codex. In Egypt, the pharaohs had long relied on stone and bronze tools, but stories of copper so resilient that it could replace iron, or even rival gold, caught the attention of their most ambitious viziers. According to chroniclers, a secret envoy traveled from Anatolia to the Nile Delta around 3300 BC, offering fragments of the Codex in exchange for copper ingots and caravans of grain. This envoy was said to have died mysteriously during the journey, leaving only cryptic copper plates inscribed with an unfamiliar script. These plates, though partially deciphered, were enough to spark Egypt's interest in importing advanced metallurgical techniques. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley, city-states such as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were already flourishing with organized urban planning and complex trade networks. According to the legends passed through merchant guilds, caravans carrying Anatolian copper fragments reached these cities, igniting a secret race among elites to control metal production. Some merchants allegedly offered vast treasures in exchange for a single copper plate from the Codex. Rumor has it that certain high-ranking families even hired assassins to eliminate rival metallurgists, while simultaneously spreading false fragments to mislead competitors. Entire districts of cities were said to be walled off at night, patrolled by guards wielding newly forged copper-tipped spears. Back in Anatolia, the Copper Wars escalated into full-scale city-to-city and mine-to-mine conflict, with some historians or storytellers claiming that minor kingdoms were destroyed simply for control over rumored veins mentioned in the Codex. One particularly gripping story tells of the kingdom of Heranos, which supposedly amassed the largest copper reserve in the north. Its king, convinced that the Codex promised him dominion over the entire Mediterranean, hired a secret corps of copper-clad assassins to eliminate rival kings in the surrounding regions. These assassins, known as the Verdant Blades, were said to strike under the cover of night, melting copper tools over fires to leave no trace before disappearing. The wars also triggered what some accounts describe as the first organized sabotage campaigns. Mines were flooded, tunnels collapsed, and entire hillsides were set ablaze, all in pursuit of the Codex's secrets. Rival dynasties allegedly employed spies who posed as metallurgists to infiltrate enemy workshops, learn their techniques, and even poison copper ingots so that swords and axes would shatter in battle. This led to countless skirmishes where armies armed with copper weapons clashed, only to see their prized weapons fail at critical moments. Some tales even tell of copper catapults melting in the sun, turning entire sieges into chaotic retreats in the Black Sea region. The story becomes even more conspiratorial. The Vanna elites, already renowned for their gold and copper craftsmanship, reportedly created a secret alliance with maritime traders. They sent emissaries to the Aegean Islands with partial codex fragments, sparking a covert network of treasure hunters, smugglers, and assassins across hundreds of kilometers. One account, though unverifiable, claims that a rogue Vanna metallurgist hid a copper tablet inside the skull of a sacrificial bull, leaving it as a secret instruction manual for future generations. Over the centuries, countless explorers, scholars, and mercenaries allegedly searched the hillsides, caves, and rivers for that hidden tablet, each meeting a mysterious end. But the Codex's influence didn't stop with wars or assassination. Some stories suggest that it spurred technological leaps in unexpected ways. Metallurgists who glimpsed its secrets learned to craft alloys that could flex like leather yet cut like obsidian, allowing soldiers to wear copper armor without being weighed down, and even creating copper tools capable of slicing stone or cutting silk with ease. The Codex also allegedly contained astrological diagrams, showing metallurgists which phases of the moon and sun cycles could enhance copper strength during smelting. This created a religious technical cult of copper, where metallurgists were worshipped as intermediaries between humans and the elemental forces of metal. One legendary tale speaks of a copper oracle in the mountains of Anatolia, a mysterious figure who claimed to possess the complete codex. Tribes and mercenaries reportedly paid vast tributes in copper, gold, and precious stones to gain even a single audience. The oracle was said to predict the outcomes of battles, the rise and fall of dynasties, and even the secret locations of untapped mines, all based on knowledge drawn from the Codex. Entire armies were sometimes diverted from sieges simply because the oracle decreed it, creating a surreal blend of warfare and mysticism where metal, prophecy, and ambition became inseparable. Why this time? The wars and secretive quest for copper knowledge had grown beyond Anatolia and the Balkans, creating a chain reaction that connected multiple continents. Traders from the Mediterranean passed copper ingots and cryptic plates to Mesopotamian temple authorities, who in turn sent emissaries to the Zagros Mountains and even the Persian Gulf. In some accounts, the Persian Gulf trade network became so dominated by copper fragments that entire communities devoted themselves to hiding secret smelting techniques, while others became mercenary armies, tasked solely with protecting shipments from pirates or rival factions. Even small villages in remote regions became caught in this global web. According to the legends, a village near the Carpathians once discovered a vein of copper described in the Codex, only to be besieged by 3 rival kingdoms simultaneously. The villagers, though terrified, supposedly used ingenious smelting techniques from stolen Codex fragments to create copper traps and molten ambushes, holding off armies much larger than their own for weeks. By the time the armies retreated, the villagers had secretly removed the copper, leaving only scorched earth and whispered rumors of a mystical treasure. Through all these wars, assassinations, secret societies, and village uprisings, copper was no longer just a metal. It had become a currency of power, a symbol of divine favor, and the trigger for political intrigue across continents. Entire empires rose or fell depending on who controlled its mines, who held fragments of the Codex, and who could best manipulate its mystique. And yet, despite centuries of conflict, the full Codex remained hidden, scattered in fragments, passed secretly from hand to hand, and fueling generations of ambition, betrayal, and legend as the Copper Wars raged through Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean. The conflict quietly expanded into a shadow war spanning far-flung civilizations, each vying for a piece of the mysterious metal's power. The fragmented Emerald Copper Codex, now rumored to be only partially in human hands, became the ultimate prize. Its secrets were whispered in marketplaces, hidden inside ceremonial temples, and inscribed on copper plates that traveled thousands of kilometers under the cover of night. in Anatolia, city-states fortified their walls with copper-reinforced gates and ramparts, while emissaries disguised as traders moved secretly between rival mines, delivering coded messages etched on small copper fragments. Entire dynasties rose and fell based not on armies, but on who controlled access to these fragments. The wealthy and ambitious commissioned shadowy assassins, dubbed the Verdant Blades, to eliminate rival metallurgists who possessed even the faintest clue to the Codex's knowledge. Some assassins were said to smuggle themselves into enemy workshops, hiding inside carts of copper or crates of ingots, and then strike silently in the dead of night. Rumors tell of entire towns falling into chaos simply because a single coppersmith, holding a secret alloy formula, was assassinated. But Anatolia was not alone. In the Balkans, secret alliances formed between city-states, temples, and merchant guilds. Copper caravans traveled under armed escort, and some of the wealthiest families began stockpiling copper as a form of currency, paying mercenaries and spies to ensure their dominance over mines hundreds of kilometers away. Stories from this period tell of the Dorian Hills siege, where a minor city-state allegedly burned 3 neighboring towns simultaneously to secure copper veins, while the king secretly invited his enemies' metallurgists to a feast, only to trap them underground in a collapsing copper mine, ensuring they would never reveal their alloy secrets again. Even in Egypt, whispers of Anatolian copper reached the pharaoh's court. According to some chronicles, though unverifiable, an envoy arrived with a single copper ingot that shimmered green in the sun. Its properties were unlike any metal previously seen. Malleable yet durable, soft enough to shape yet hard enough to hold an edge sharper than obsidian. The pharaoh, intrigued, ordered covert expeditions along the Mediterranean coast, bribing sailors and mercenary captains to track down Anatolian metallurgists. Some accounts claim these expeditions clashed with Vanna traders along the Aegean, resulting in skirmishes that left entire trading fleets sunken or captured. In the Indus Valley, powerful city-states reportedly received fragments of the Codex from itinerant Anatolian merchants. One story describes a merchant prince named Ishkala, who secretly built a workshop beneath his palace. By day, he traded grain and textiles. By night, he smelted and cast copper alloys according to formulas stolen from Anatolia. His wealth grew exponentially, and rival city-states became desperate to uncover his secrets. Ishkala is said to have employed a personal army of copper-armored guards and trained elite spies to infiltrate neighboring workshops. Some legends claim that he even ordered the flooding of rivers leading to rival mines, using irrigation systems to sabotage the competition while keeping his operations hidden from prying eyes. Meanwhile, in the Carpathian Mountains, a council of metallurgists, known as the Bronze Circle, supposedly convened to decide the fate of Europe's copper reserves. These were not ordinary craftsmen. They were scholars, warriors, and mystics, sworn to keep the Codex's secrets safe. The Circle allegedly maintained hidden archives within mountain caves, guarded by traps, false tunnels, and decoy veins of copper. Rival kings and mercenary armies tried for decades to locate these archives, often failing or disappearing without a trace. Legends say the Circle sometimes employed copper automata, primitive constructs shaped from alloys, that acted as guardians against intruders, a tale so fantastical that many dismissed it as myth, yet accounts persisted of travelers disappearing in the mountains, never to return. The wars, assassinations, and secret alliances escalated to unprecedented levels. Entire cities were fortified with copper-tipped spears, gates, and walls, and rumors suggest that some rulers paid entire mercenary armies in copper ingots. Some families allegedly amassed fortunes so vast that they could hire assassins to eliminate rival kings or even influence neighboring kingdoms through intimidation. One story tells of the king of Larnaca, who supposedly ordered the assassination of a rival ruler by bribing miners to collapse a mine shaft on the king's way home, ensuring that he would never return from a diplomatic visit. Meanwhile, trade routes became living battlefields. Caravans carrying copper from Anatolia to the Balkans were ambushed by desperate city-states and pirate factions. These pirates were said to use copper hooks, blades, and even small cannons to intercept caravans, melting down the stolen copper to create weapons for themselves. Some chronicles describe entire battles where armies met in river valleys to fight over a single shipment of copper ingots, each side using spies, assassins, and sabotage to gain an edge. And then there were the myths of secret experiments. Metallurgists supposedly combined Anatolian copper with rare ores from the Zagros Mountains, creating alloys with strange properties. Swords that could bend under pressure and snap back, armor that seemed lighter than cloth yet impervious to flint, and ritual vessels that could survive the hottest fires without cracking. Some legends even claim that certain metallurgists were able to create small copper mirrors capable of signaling over mountains, long before optical systems were historically documented. These innovations fueled both awe and paranoia among rulers, leading to a new culture of espionage and intrigue that rivaled any known ancient kingdom. By this stage, wars over copper were no longer local. They had become continental, touching Anatolia, the Balkans, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and beyond. Some stories even suggest that small maritime city-states along the Persian Gulf were bribed, threatened, or assassinated simply to redirect copper shipments, creating a web of covert operations that historians could only speculate about. Entire generations were born into a world where every mine, caravan, and workshop could be a battlefield, and where metallurgists, assassins, spies, and kings were all part of a single, sprawling chess game. The legends of the Copper Wars persisted for centuries, embedded into local myths, epic tales, and secret oral traditions. Even after the fall of the Vanna elites, the disappearance of Anatolian dynasties, and the collapse of certain Indus Valley city-states, the codex's fragments continue to circulate, carried by wandering metallurgists, traders, and clandestine guilds. It became a story told in whispers, of kings assassinated over a single copper ingot, of city-states razed for access to secret mines, and of metallurgists whose discoveries could alter the fate of empires. Ultimately, copper had transformed from a simple tool into a catalyst for human ambition, intrigue, and conflict. Its influence rippled through generations, shaping social hierarchies, inspiring secret societies, and fueling wars that spanned continents. By the end of this period, copper was no longer just a metal. It was power, wealth, and survival itself. And those who controlled it held the fate of entire civilizations in their hands. As the centuries of copper-driven conflict stretched across continents, whispers began to circulate of entire civilizations being secretly controlled by the mysterious allure of copper. It was no longer merely a tool or currency. It had become the lifeblood of kingdoms, the thread connecting commerce, war, and mysticism. In Anatolia, the ruins of old Vanna settlements were repurposed by cunning warlords who had survived the collapse of city-states, creating shadow empires that thrived on secrecy and strategic copper reserves. The Copper Codex, now fractured into dozens of hidden sections, was said to grant metallurgists and rulers the knowledge to manipulate not just copper, but the politics, trade, and even the fate of nations. Some allege that kings paid enormous tributes, sometimes measured in entire tons of copper, to acquire even a single fragment, using it to gain the upper hand over rivals. One story tells of the king of Lydora, who ordered his top generals to poison the spring feeding a rival city-state's mines, allowing his armies to seize the veins while the other city starved of resources. According to chroniclers, this single act allowed him to dominate trade across 3 seas. Meanwhile, along the Balkan coasts, secret maritime alliances formed, and copper-laden fleets became floating fortresses. Entire crews were trained in metallurgy, espionage, and sabotage, able to melt down captured copper to forge weapons on the spot, reinforcing their ships and outfitting them for the next raid. Legendary accounts describe the siege of Blackwater Harbor, where 5 fleets converged to capture a shipment of Anatolian copper. Each side employed false flag operations, disguising their ships as merchants while secretly planting copper signal mirrors to communicate across miles of sea. It is said that the battle lasted days, with no clear victor, but the harbor itself became a symbol of Kappa's ability to shape not just economies, but lives and nations. In the east, stories from the Indus Valley claim that Ishkala's descendants, still guarding secret metallurgical knowledge, began to influence neighboring city-states. Allegedly, they trained elite assassins to infiltrate other kingdoms, stealing recipes for copper alloys and smelting techniques, sometimes returning the information with subtle modifications to ensure that the original kingdom's metals would fail in battle. These stories include accounts of rulers being toppled not by armies, but by tools breaking mid-conflict, axes snapping, chariots immobilized because copper fittings failed, all orchestrated by unseen hands controlling the flow of metal. Even beyond the Mediterranean, legend suggests that the copper intrigue reached Egypt and Mesopotamia. Pharaohs and temple authorities allegedly commissioned secret copper cults, devoted to protecting sacred ingots believed to have mystical powers. According to some tales, priests etched hidden symbols on copper vessels, believed to hold protective magic or predict enemy movements, blending metallurgy with early forms of intelligence gathering. Entire military campaigns were sometimes planned based on these interpretations, and rival kings often paid bribes or even assassins to steal or deface these sacred artifacts. The influence of copper reached into the mountains of Anatolia, where the Bronze Circle, descendants of the original Balkan metallurgists, reportedly maintained hidden forges in caves accessible only through secret tunnels. Some stories tell of copper automata guarding these caves, statues forged from bronze and copper alloys, designed to topple or strike anyone who dared intrude. These legendary guardians were said to operate on primitive counterweights and pulleys, a technology centuries ahead of its time, capable of scaring even seasoned warriors away. Wars escalated further when copper-rich regions began forming in formal coalitions. Kings and metallurgists who had once been rivals found temporary alliances more profitable than conflict, exchanging knowledge and assassins for favors. Yet these alliances were fragile. A single assassination or secret shipment could collapse an entire coalition. Stories speak of the Battle of the Emerald Mines, where 3 coalitions simultaneously attacked a single copper deposit. Spies infiltrated each camp, spreading false intelligence, while mercenaries secretly redirected supply caravans. By the time the dust settled, the mine had changed hands multiple times in 1 week, and the victorious coalition emerged not because of strength, but because they had bribed the local miners to collapse tunnels behind the enemy. Beyond military and economic intrigue, copper also influenced culture and social hierarchy. Some urban legends claim that kingdoms would publicly display enormous copper sculptures, while secretly hoarding smaller ingots for political leverage. The wealthiest families were said to commission secret inscriptions inside ingots, marking ownership and leaving hidden messages for their heirs. Entire societies were believed to measure prestige and power not by gold, but by how much copper one controlled, with clandestine competitions shaping marriages, alliances, and even wars in Mesopotamia. The story takes a darker turn. Accounts, though unverified, claim that temple authorities secretly employed a network of copper spies who traveled to distant lands, carrying ingots embedded with hidden compartments containing messages, seeds, and formulas. Some envoys were said to travel for years, living disguised as merchants, while others carried tiny copper daggers with inscribed codes, used to eliminate rival clerics or metallurgists who refused to share knowledge. The intertwining of copper, politics, and religion created a shadow economy invisible to ordinary citizens, yet absolutely decisive in determining which city-states survived and which fell, and the chaos did not stop at kingdoms or continents. Certain legends describe that entire copper wars were fought at sea, with fleets attempting to intercept shipments destined for distant lands. One of the most famous, the Battle of the Shimmering Strait, supposedly involved a fleet of Anatolian copper-clad ships attempting to block the Indus Valley merchants from delivering copper to the Persian Gulf. According to chroniclers, the battle lasted 40 days and 40 nights, with fire rafts, submerged spike traps, and secret cannon-like devices forged from copper alloys. Some say that the battle changed trade routes permanently, forcing centuries of rerouted commerce and alliances built entirely on who controlled access to copper. Meanwhile, secret factions in Anatolia reportedly began to experiment with combining copper with other metals, creating alloys that could influence the course of battle or the productivity of mines. Some stories suggest that certain metallurgists discovered that mixing copper with trace minerals could create tools that seemed almost alive, bending without breaking or sharpening themselves with repeated strikes. Legends tell of kings paying immense fortunes just to obtain these miraculous tools, while others were willing to assassinate entire rival families to prevent the secrets from spreading to be why this stage. The world had entered what historians would later call the Shadow Age of Copper, a time when wars, diplomacy, trade, religion, and assassination were all dictated by this single metal. Entire civilizations were shaped, conquered, or destroyed depending on who controlled the mines, caravans, and forges. From Anatolia to the Balkans, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, copper was no longer a commodity. It was power incarnate, the lifeblood of kings, the obsession of merchants, and the instrument of fate itself. Even stories of copper-driven espionage reached into the imagination of ordinary villagers. Tales circulated of mysterious figures who could disappear into the night with a single ingot, only to reappear weeks later in distant lands with a secret alliance secured or a rival kingdom weakened. These figures were often referred to as the Copper Shadows, mercenaries, spies, or even alchemists who used the metal's allure to manipulate events far beyond their apparent reach. The legends continued to grow, blending fact with fabrication. One particularly gripping tale tells of a secret copper vault hidden beneath the ruins of Troy, allegedly containing enough metal to fund 100 armies, guarded by deadly traps, complex puzzles, and automatons forged centuries before anyone could imagine them. Many tried to find it, including wandering mercenaries, Anatolian kings, and Balkan guilds, but none returned to tell the tale. Rumors of its existence alone were enough to spark wars, alliances, and betrayals, proving that copper could influence history even when unseen to BY 4000 BC. The world of copper had evolved far beyond simple tools and ornaments. Entire regions were now governed, not by armies alone, but by those who controlled the flow of copper, its mines, its forges, and its secret caches. Stories of the Copper Emperor of Anatolia, a semi-legendary figure whose real name had been lost to time, circulated from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. According to chroniclers, he began as a minor metallurgist, but through cunning alliances, bribery, and the occasional covert assassination, he managed to control nearly every major copper source in the region. It is said that his rise to power involved a network of spies and saboteurs known as the Crimson Alloy, who would infiltrate rival city-states, posing as merchants or laborers. Their task was not always to steal copper outright. Sometimes it was enough to alter furnace temperatures, subtly changing the quality of the metal so that tools and weapons would fail at critical moments. According to legend, a single flawed copper spear could determine the outcome of an entire battle, and the Crimson Alloy exploited this relentlessly. The Copper Emperor's influence extended far beyond Anatolia. Tales recount that he secretly funded wars between neighboring kingdoms, ensuring that while they weakened each other, his coffers and mines expanded. Some stories suggest he even paid rival kings to assassinate one another, using the profits to consolidate control over mining towns. One notorious event, the Night of Shattered Axes, allegedly involved the simultaneous assassination of 3 rival metallurgists in separate cities. Their deaths destabilized entire regions, allowing the Copper Emperor to seize control of trade routes and monopolize high-quality copper for decades. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, another shadow empire emerged. The island guild of Lemnos, a confederation of seafaring traders and metallurgists, specialized in smuggling copper between Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Indus Valley. Their ships, according to legend, were clad in thin copper sheets, making them nearly invisible at dawn or dusk due to the reflective surface of the sea. Chroniclers describe daring raids, where entire fleets would block harbors and redirect copper shipments while leaving no trace of their presence. Rumors tell of secret tunnels carved under coastal towns, used to hide shipments and store them for years, creating strategic reserves that could shift the balance of power. In the north, the Balkan Copper League rose to prominence, a coalition of city-states and mining settlements united under a loose treaty. The League's leaders allegedly developed copper-forged weapons that could be reshaped in the field, a terrifying innovation that allowed armies to repair axes, spearheads, and armor mid-battle. There are accounts of a battle of the shifting blades, where opposing armies fought for days, only for both sides' weapons to be subtly sabotaged overnight by hidden metallurgists. These tales, passed down in local oral histories, portray copper not just as a material, but as a weapon of strategy, espionage, and intrigue. Even the Mesopotamian city-states became entangled in this web of copper-fueled power struggles. Temple authorities and kings are said to have established secret copper vaults beneath ziggurats, containing ores from Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains, and even distant regions along the Arabian Peninsula. Legends tell of priests using copper mirrors to send coded light signals across rivers and valleys, warning of enemy movements or coordinating trade and military actions. Some stories claim that these copper signals were so sophisticated that entire invasions were foiled simply by observing reflected flashes of sunlight, giving defenders time to prepare. The rise of the copper assassins, mercenaries skilled in sabotage, espionage, and the manipulation of metal, added another layer of danger. Stories describe them poisoning rivals' water supplies with copper salts, contaminating entire regions without leaving obvious evidence. Other tales recount secret guilds of metallurgists who could forge tools with hidden compartments, capable of delivering deadly toxins, messages, or even microweapons across battlefields or marketplaces. These assassins were often employed by kings, priests, or wealthy merchants who viewed copper as more than wealth. It was influence, leverage, and a guarantee of survival. Legends also claim that entire wars were fought over the smallest deposits. One tale tells of a week-long siege between two city-states near the Taurus Mountains, where armies never clashed in open combat. Instead, both sides tried to outwit each other by poisoning furnaces, redirecting copper flows, and bribing local miners. By the end of the conflict, the city that controlled the smallest vein of high-grade copper had effectively gained dominance over the surrounding region. The fascination with copper extended into art, religion, and mysticism. Stories recount secret sects of alchemists and metallurgists who believed copper could connect humans to the divine, claiming that ingots infused with rare minerals could protect kings, foresee battles, or even influence weather. Allegedly, these sects would inscribe invisible codes onto copper surfaces, visible only under certain light, revealing instructions for forging weapons, guiding armies, or manipulating trade alliances. Some of these codes, according to rumor, were never fully deciphered, creating a mythos that lasted centuries. The Copper Empire era reached its climax with the rise of the Tricontinental Copper Alliance, a secret coalition uniting Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Indus Valley. While outwardly appearing as normal trading partners, their hidden objective was control. Every mine, every shipment, every forge was mapped and monitored. Stories tell of caravans carrying copper being shadowed by assassins, spies, and mercenaries, ensuring no ingot left their control without precise knowledge of its destination. Entire cities allegedly rose or fell based on whether the alliance sanctioned copper flows, making the metal the invisible king behind the throne. The heart of these legends is the recurring theme. Copper was never merely a material. It was power, it was war, it was survival. Cities, kingdoms, and dynasties were secretly won or lost over the control of mines, forges, and caches. Chronicles speak of hidden vaults beneath mountains, underwater caches in coastal caves, and even secret deposits beneath sacred temples, all fiercely protected, all capable of shaping history in ways ordinary people could barely imagine. The Copper Empire era, therefore, becomes a story not just of metallurgy, but of human ambition, greed, cunning, and invention. It shows how a single metal could weave a web connecting kingdoms, priests, assassins, and merchants, creating a world where the line between myth and history blurs. And it sets the stage for the next chapter, when copper's power would extend beyond kingdoms into the formation of early continental empires, influencing trade, war, and civilization in ways the ancient world had never seen before. As the centuries passed, the influence of copper transformed from the secret ambitions of kings and assassins into the foundation of empires, shaping entire continents in ways no one could have predicted. By 3500 BC, the scattered city-states, guilds, and mining towns that had once competed in shadowy conflicts now found themselves bound by a web of trade, war, and diplomacy dictated by copper. Legends say that copper was no longer just a metal. It had become a language of power, a currency of survival, and a hidden engine of civilization itself. In Anatolia, the mighty city of Troy had grown from a fortified trade hub into the first continental copper metropolis, a city where every wall, every tower, and every administrative building was connected to the flow of metal. Massive warehouses stored ingots from the Taurus Mountains, the Pontic Ranges, and distant Balkan mines, while workshops forged not only tools and weapons, but intricately decorated ceremonial items that symbolized both wealth and divine favor. According to stories passed down through generations, Troy's rulers maintained secret tunnels beneath the city, linking storage vaults directly to harbors, enabling shipments to disappear or appear overnight, controlled entirely by the whims of the city's copper masters. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, the Copper League had consolidated control over hundreds of mining towns. Tales recount a legendary figure known as the Hammer King, a metallurgist warrior who could forge weapons capable of splitting stone or bending bronze. It was said that the Hammer King once challenged an entire army to battle, not by leading troops, but by sabotaging every copper weapon they possessed, turning spears to brittle rods and armor into useless sheets. His feats became the subject of epic stories. One recounted a night raid where he supposedly planted sleeping copper traps in enemy workshops, which would fail at dawn, rendering an entire city defenseless without spilling a drop of blood. Trade networks flourished alongside these tales of cunning and conquest. Caravans crossed mountains, rivers, and seas, carrying copper from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Aegean Islands. According to some legends, merchants would encrypt secret messages in the shape of copper ingots, with hidden compartments containing instructions for political alliances, assassination orders, or shipment reroutes. Entire cities were allegedly influenced by the arrival or absence of these ingots, and historians sometimes whisper that wars were won or lost before a single soldier ever raised a sword, simply because one shipment of copper failed to arrive on time. The Mesopotamian city-states, building upon centuries of metallurgical innovation, became the first truly urban civilizations, where temples controlled production, trade, and law. Stories tell of high priests wielding copper rods as instruments of authority, both symbolic and practical, able to command armies, oversee irrigation networks, and even enforce secret justice against rival elites. Some accounts suggest that these priests had a monopoly on alloys, mixing copper with tin, arsenic, or gold to produce objects that could confer status, wealth, or even influence over entire communities. Copper, in this world, was more than a tool. It was the very medium of power. Yet with power came envy, betrayal, and conflict. Across the ancient world, copper-fueled wars erupted, sometimes between cities, sometimes between entire regions. Legends describe the War of the Three Mines, where Anatolia, the Balkans, and Mesopotamia each sought control over the richest copper deposits. It is said that spies and assassins roamed every border, sabotaging furnaces, poisoning water supplies, and bribing miners to switch allegiance. Stories tell of entire city-states vanishing overnight, not from battle, but from the strategic denial of copper, leaving armies immobile, tools useless, and economies paralyzed. Some historians claim that maps of the ancient world were redrawn entirely based on which kingdom could maintain uninterrupted access to copper. Even in the far reaches of the Indus Valley, the copper trade sparked legends of merchant kings who would marry into foreign dynasties to secure, or only to orchestrate secret raids months later. One tale tells of a caravan disguised as a wedding procession, carrying copper ingots hidden beneath ornate textiles. En route, it was intercepted by rival merchants who had bribed local guards. The story recounts how the bride's family supposedly used hidden copper daggers to reclaim the shipment, turning a diplomatic union into a high-stakes heist. An epic tale that has been told for millennia as a lesson in greed, cunning, and the power of copper. As centuries passed, the most ambitious rulers realized that copper alone was not enough. They began minting authority into bronze and gold, creating symbols of wealth that went beyond the practical utility of tools and weapons. Legends speak of a secret council, sometimes called the Circle of Shining Hands, composed of the wealthiest copper lords across Europe and Mesopotamia. This council allegedly dictated global trade, influenced royal successions, and orchestrated wars from the shadows, ensuring that copper and its derivative alloys remained the ultimate currency of power. The stories converge on a dramatic truth. Copper was the first silent architect of civilization, the unseen force shaping empires, economies, and wars. Without it, the mega-settlements of the Balkans would never have existed. Mesopotamia would have lacked the tools to irrigate and build cities, and Anatolia might have remained a patchwork of isolated villages. Copper's influence reached into religion, politics, art, and espionage, turning ordinary humans into players on a stage of ambition and intrigue. That'd be why the time the first true empires rose, the world had been irrevocably changed. The Copper Age was not merely an era of tools and ornaments. It was a period where human ingenuity, ambition, and greed intertwined with the lust for metal, creating stories of betrayal, heroism, and mystery that would echo through the millennia. From secret assassins to cunning merchants, from haunted mines to city-wide conspiracies, the legacy of copper shaped the very course of human history. And even today, its echoes can be felt in the foundations of civilization. And so, the saga of copper ends not with a battle or a collapse, but with a truth whispered across the ages. Metal, in the hands of humanity, is never just matter. It is power, influence, and the seed of empires yet to come.